6 ruthless cartel enforcers kicked down the door of a remote ranch in Arizona. They thought they'd found an easy mark, just another isolated old farmer, helpless and alone. They couldn't have been more wrong. Their target, 72-year-old Jack Sullivan, wasn't your ordinary rancher. Decades ago, he hunted the world's deadliest terrorists across Afghanistan and Iraq, a legend whose name struck fear into America's enemies. Tonight, the hunters become the hunted. Armed only with skills sharpened by years of covert warfare, Sullivan is about to remind these cartel killers of a brutal truth. Some warriors never truly retire. But before we jump back into the video, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something really special for you. And now, back to the video. The midnight air crackled with tension as the cartel's black SUVs crawled up the dusty ranch road, headlights off, engines purring like predatory cats. Inside the lead vehicle, Marco El Coyote Ramirez squeezed his gold-plated Desert Eagle, a cruel smile playing across his scarred face. This was supposed to be a simple job. Old man Sullivan had refused to let them use his ranch as a transit point. Now, they'd make an example of him. What they didn't see was the shadow moving through the darkness, each step calculated, each movement precise. Jack Sullivan stood in his darkened kitchen, his weathered hands steady as he methodically checked his old service weapon. The distant crunch of gravel under tires hadn't escaped his notice. It never did. 30 years of combat experience had honed his senses to a razor's edge, and age hadn't dulled them one bit. The ranch house sat silent, a lonely sentinel against the vast Arizona desert. Its windows were dark, making it look deserted to the untrained eye. But inside, Sullivan had already begun his preparations. His fingers traced familiar patterns in the darkness, checking ammunition, securing entry points, mentally mapping every squeak in the floorboards, every shadow that could provide cover. The memories flooded back unbidden. Kandahar, 2002. The pitch black mountains where he'd tracked a high-value target for 7 days straight. Baghdad, 2004. The urban warfare that had taught him how to turn any building into a fortress. Now, those lessons would serve him one final time. El Coyote's men spread out around the house with practiced efficiency, their modern tactical gear a stark contrast to Sullivan's simple rancher's clothes. They moved like wolves circling wounded prey, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. The leader raised his hand, signaling the breach. The front door exploded inward with a thunderous crash. The enforcers poured in, their weapon-mounted lights cutting through the darkness like silver blades. But the house answered back with an eerie silence. No screams, no pleas for mercy. Just the quiet tick of an old grandfather clock marking time, in the corner. "Clear the rooms," El Coyote barked in Spanish, his voice barely above a whisper. "Find him." In the shadows of his home, Sullivan felt a familiar calm settle over him. It was the same stillness he'd known in countless operations, the laser-sharp focus that had kept him alive when everything went sideways. His breath slowed, his heartbeat steady. He wasn't some helpless old man caught in a nightmare. He was a hunter back in his element. The first enforcer died silently, Sullivan's combat knife finding its mark with surgical precision. The body was quickly dragged into the shadows, the other, cartel members none the wiser. In the darkness, Sullivan became a ghost, a whisper of death moving through his own home. The second enforcer's radio crackled. "Miguel, report." Silence answered. Tension began to creep into their movements, their earlier confidence cracking like thin ice. They'd come expecting to terrorize an old man. Instead, they'd walked into the killing ground of a veteran operator. A floorboard creaked upstairs, drawing their attention. 2 more enforcers moved to investigate, their weapons trained on the darkness above. They never saw Sullivan emerge from the hidden space behind the stairs, a space he'd prepared years ago for exactly this kind of situation. 2 precise shots, suppressed and deadly accurate, and the cartel's numbers were cut in half. El Coyote felt the first stirrings of real fear. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. His remaining man pressed close to him, both now moving back to back, eyes wide and searching the shadows. The house had become a maze of death, each corner potentially hiding their doom. "We need to pull back," his last man whispered, panic evident in his voice. "This isn't—" The words died in his throat as Sullivan's garrote found its mark. El Coyote, spun, firing wildly into the darkness. His gold-plated Desert Eagle's muzzle flash temporarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, he was alone. A voice spoke from the shadows, calm and steady as a midnight desert wind. "You boys picked the wrong ranch." The words carried decades of authority, of missions in places that didn't officially exist, of battles fought, far from any hope of rescue or support. El Coyote's hands trembled as he swept his weapon back and forth, trying to locate the source of the voice. "We'll bring more men," he threatened, his earlier bravado crumbling. "The entire cartel will—" "No," Sullivan interrupted, now somehow behind him. "You won't." The last thing Marco El Coyote Ramirez saw was the face of a legend, weathered by time but hardened by decades of combat. In those steel-grey eyes, he saw his own death approaching, delivered by a warrior who'd never truly laid down his arms. Outside, the Arizona desert remained unchanged, indifferent to the violence it had just witnessed. The only signs that anything had happened were 6 empty SUVs parked haphazardly around a lonely ranch house, their engines cooling in the midnight air. Inside, Jack Sullivan methodically began cleaning up, his movements as precise and professional as they'd been 30 years ago in far-off war zones. Some skills never fade, some warriors never retire, and sometimes the deadliest predator is the one you mistake for prey. The morning sun painted long shadows across Jack Sullivan's ranch as he moved through his daily routine with military precision. At 72, his body might have slowed, but his mind remained sharp as ever. The coffee pot burbled in the kitchen, always set for 5:30 a.m., just as it had been during his decades of service. Old habits died hard, especially those forged in combat. He stood at his kitchen window, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly before him, a sea of rust and gold that reminded him of another desert half a world away. His ranch, 300 acres of mostly scrubland, sat 40 miles from the nearest town, exactly how he liked it. The isolation wasn't just preference, it was protection. Sullivan's calloused hands wrapped around his coffee mug, the ceramic warm against his skin. The wall behind him held only 2 photographs, one of his late wife Sarah, smiling from their wedding day 30 years ago, and another of his old special operations team in Afghanistan. Both represented lives he'd lived and lost. The sound of approaching horses drew his attention. Through the window, he spotted his neighbor and only real friend, Miguel Ortiz, riding up with his teenage daughter, Rosa. Miguel had been the only person to truly break through Sullivan's carefully maintained isolation. Over the past 5 years, "Jack!" Miguel called out as he dismounted. At 50, Miguel was significantly younger than Sullivan, but they shared a soldier's understanding. Miguel had served 2 tours in Iraq before returning home to run his family's ranch. "Brought you some of Rosa's fresh-baked bread," Maria insisted. Sullivan stepped onto his porch, a genuine smile crossing his weathered face. "You Ortiz women spoil me." He nodded to Rosa, who beamed back. At 16, she reminded him painfully of the daughter he'd never had. "Papa says you're teaching him new security measures," Rosa said, handing over the bread. "Is it because of those men who've been asking questions in town?" Sullivan's expression hardened slightly, but he kept his voice casual. "Just sharing some old tricks of the trade. Your father's always looking to improve his ranch security." The lie tasted bitter, but it was necessary. No need to worry the girl about the cartel's growing presence in the region. After Rosa rode off to check their southern fence line, Miguel's expression turned serious. "They were at my place yesterday, Jack. 3 of them. All smiles and friendly words, but their eyes." He shook his head. "They're looking for transit routes, safe houses." Sullivan led Miguel inside, his movements deliberately calm. "Tell me everything." "They're offering money first. Good money. But we both know what comes after the offers." Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he accepted a cup of coffee. "I've seen what they do to families who refuse. In Mexico, my cousin's ranch." "I know," Sullivan interrupted softly. He'd tracked similar cartels during his later years of service, seen the brutality they were capable of. Have they approached anyone else? "The Hendersons sold last month. Didn't say to who, but—" Miguel shrugged. "Now there's new construction, extra security. Nobody local hired for the work." Sullivan moved to his study, Miguel following. The room looked like it belonged to a simple rancher. Riding trophies, old books, a rifle mounted above the fireplace. But appearances, like so much in Sullivan's life, were deceiving. He pulled out a map of the region, one marked with recent property sales, patrol routes, suspicious activity. To most eyes, it would look like the paranoid scribblings of an old man. To those who knew what to look for, it told a story of systematic cartel expansion into the region. "They're creating a corridor," Sullivan explained, tracing lines between properties. "Your ranch, mine. We're the last holdouts between their new routes and the interstate." His finger tapped a spot on the map. "They'll need our land, Miguel. One way or another." Miguel studied the map, his face pale. "Maria wants us to sell, take the money, move north. Maybe she's right." Sullivan straightened, something of the old operator entering his stance. "Your family has worked this land for 3 generations. Running won't solve anything. They'll just keep pushing, taking more territory, destroying more lives." "What's the alternative?" Miguel demanded. "Fight them? They have armies, Jack. We're just ranchers." A ghost of a smile crossed Sullivan's face. "Are we?" He moved to his desk, opened a hidden compartment beneath. Inside lay a satellite phone and a leather-bound notebook. "I made some calls last week, reached out to old contacts. Remember Thomas Chen?" Miguel's eyes widened. "Your demolitions expert from Afghanistan, semi-retired now, working security consulting in Texas. He's been tracking cartel movements too, says this group is the Reynosa faction. They're aggressive, expanding fast, but sloppy." Sullivan's voice took on the quiet authority that had once commanded elite teams in the world's deadliest places. "And they're not the only ones building networks." He showed Miguel another map, this one marked with names: former operators, intelligence agents, combat veterans. All people who owed Sullivan favors or who shared his particular set of skills and moral code. "Jesus, Jack," Miguel whispered. "How long have you been preparing for this? Since they first showed up in the region 6 months ago." Sullivan's expression was grim. "I didn't spend 30 years hunting the world's worst people just to retire and watch them set up shop in my backyard." "But you're—" Miguel hesitated. "Old?" Sullivan finished with a dry chuckle. "Age is just a number, my friend. Experience, that's something else entirely." He tapped the notebook. "I've got enough information here to seriously disrupt their operations, staging areas, corrupt officials, shipping routes. We may be outnumbered, but we're not outmatched." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sullivan moved with practiced silence to the window, checking the approach. "Rosa," he said, relaxing slightly. But something was wrong. The girl was riding, hard, her horse lathered with sweat. They met her on the porch, Miguel catching her as she practically fell from the saddle. "Men," she gasped. "By the south fence. They're watching the house, taking pictures. They had guns, Papa." Sullivan's mind shifted instantly into operational mode, decades of training taking over. "Miguel, get your family to the storm cellar, the one we reinforced last month. I'll call in some friends." "Jack," Miguel protested. "They'll kill you." Sullivan checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Maybe, but I've died 1,000 times in 1,000 places, never stuck." His smile was wolf-like. "Besides, I won't be alone. Chen's already in position at the old Watson place. Has been for 3 days. Miguel stared at his friend, finally seeing behind the carefully maintained facade of a simple rancher. The deadly operator was still there, had always been there, waiting. "Rosa," Sullivan said softly, "remember those riding lessons I've been giving you, the special trails I showed you?" The girl nodded. "Good. You know where to take the family. Don't stop for anything." As the Ortiz family prepared to leave, Sullivan made his way to the hidden room beneath his study. The space was small but efficient, filled with equipment that would have raised serious questions if ever discovered. Communications gear, weapons, tactical supplies, all carefully maintained over the years. He picked up the satellite phone, dialed, a number from memory. "Chen, they're making their move. Time to activate the network." A pause. "Yes, all of them. And Tom, tell Jenkins to bring the special equipment. We're not just stopping them. We're sending a message." Hanging up, Sullivan began his own preparations. His movements were measured, precise, each piece of gear checked and secured with the same attention to detail that had kept him alive in countless operations. Ferenc House, his home for the past decade, was about to become a battlefield. He thought of Sarah, of the peaceful life they'd planned together before cancer took her. "Sorry, love. murmured to her photograph. Looks like retirement's going to have to wait a little longer. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. Sullivan moved through his house, setting up fields of fire, preparing fallback positions, rigging surprises for unwelcome visitors. To an outsider, it might have seemed like paranoia. To a man who'd spent his life in the shadows, it was simply prudence. His satellite phone buzzed. A text from Chen. Teams in position. Jenkins ETA 2 hours. Henderson Ranch compromised. Cartel staging area confirmed. Sullivan allowed himself a grim smile. The cartel thought they were dealing with a stubborn old rancher. They were about to learn a costly lesson about appearances and reality. They weren't just facing one old operator. They were about to run headlong into a network of veterans who'd spent their lives dealing with exactly this kind of threat. A distant engine sound caught his attention. Heavy vehicles, multiple sets of tires on the access road. Earlier than expected, but not unprepared for. Sullivan moved to his command position, the familiar weight of his tactical gear, a comfort rather than a burden. All teams, be advised, he spoke into his encrypted radio. Party crashers arriving early. Maintain positions. Wait for my signal. A chorus of acknowledgements came back, professional, confident, ready. Through his high-powered optics, Sullivan counted vehicles, 4 SUVs, 2 pickup trucks, all moving with the arrogance of predators who thought they owned the territory. He recognized their type. He'd fought their kind across 3 continents. They were dangerous, yes, but predictable. They relied on brutality and numbers, never expecting serious resistance. His phone buzzed again, a message from Rosa. Family secure at Waypoint Charlie. Maria says to try not to get shot this time. Sullivan chuckled despite the situation. Maria Ortiz, Miguel's wife, had patched him up more than once over the years, never asking questions about the suspicious nature of his injuries. She was as much a part of this fight as any of them. The cartel vehicles were getting closer now, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Sullivan didoned final equipment check, then settled into position. Years ago, in mountains far from here, his team had earned a reputation. The ghosts who hunted other ghosts, they'd been called. Tonight, he'd remind these cartel enforcers why some legends are best left undisturbed. Remember your training, he sub-vocalized, an old habit from his instructor days. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Let them make the mistakes. The mantra centered him, brought that familiar combat clarity into focus. The first vehicle was nearly at his outer security perimeter. Sullivan keyed his radio one final time. All teams, hold for initiation. Let them think they've got us surrounded. He paused, then added, Welcome back to the hunt, gentlemen. Behind him, the ranch house stood quiet and dark, a deceptively vulnerable target in the dying light. But looks, as Sullivan had proven countless times over his long career, could be fatally deceiving. The cartel was about to learn that some old soldiers don't fade away, they just wait patiently for the fight to come to them. The cartel's convoy approached Sullivan's ranch with predatory confidence, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness like searching fingers. Inside the lead vehicle, Javier El Serpiente Martinez touched the religious medallion hanging from his rearview mirror, a habit before every operation. Behind him, 15 heavily armed men waited in 5 vehicles, all veterans of the cartel's bloodiest operations. Remember, Martinez spoke into his radio, his voice carrying the authority of countless successful raids. We need to make an example of this one. The other ranchers need to understand the cost of defiance. Sullivan watched their approach through his thermal scope, counting heartbeats. The familiar pre-mission calm had settled over him, decades of experience distilling into pure focus. His hidden network of veterans was in place, waiting for his signal, but timing would be everything. Contact in 3, he murmured into his encrypted radio. Chen, status? Charges set on their escape route, came the whispered reply. Jenkins' team is in position with anti-vehicle measures. They're in the kill box. They just don't know it, yet. The cartel convoys split into their practiced formation, 3 vehicles approaching the main house, while the others circled wide to cover potential escape routes. Sullivan allowed himself a grim smile. They were professionals, but they were playing by an outdated rulebook. His satellite phone vibrated. A message from Miguel. Local police chief just called cartel contacts. Says he can't guarantee no response if gunfire is reported. Copy that, Sullivan replied. Everything was proceeding according to his intelligence assessment. The cartel had corrupted some local officials, but they hadn't had time to secure total control. That gap in their operation was about to become costly. The lead vehicle stopped, 200 yards from the house. Martinez stepped out, his gold-plated pistol catching the last rays of sunlight. "Sullivan," he shouted. "We can do this the easy way. You know why we're here." Sullivan's response came in the form of precise rifle fire. 3 shots in rapid succession, each round finding the engine blocks of the nearest vehicles. The satisfying sound of dying engines filled the air as the cartel members dove for cover, their confident demeanor shattered by the sudden display of skill. "All teams, execute," Sullivan commanded, his voice deadly calm. The night erupted into carefully orchestrated chaos. Hidden charges detonated along the cartel's escape route, the explosions carefully calculated to disable vehicles without causing casualties. Yet, from concealed positions, Sullivan's veterans opened fire with devastating accuracy. Decades of combined combat experience, evident in every shot. Martinez barked orders, trying to regain control of the situation. "Return fire! Find this hijo de puta!" But his men were shooting blind, wasting ammunition against an enemy they couldn't see. Sullivan moved like a ghost, through his pre-planned routes, each position offering perfect fields of fire. His first direct target was a cartel gunman trying to set up a heavy machine gun. The man died without ever seeing what hit him. Sullivan's suppressed rifle barely making a sound above the chaos. "They're not alone," someone screamed in Spanish. "It's an ambush." "Of course it's an ambush," Sullivan muttered, switching positions. "What did you expect from a man who spent 30 years setting them?" Chen's voice crackled over the radio. "Mobile team approaching from the south. Looks like their backup plan." "Jenkins?" "All ready." "On it," came the reply, followed by the distinctive sound of a MK-19 grenade launcher cycling. The approaching reinforcements found their path blocked by precise explosive interventions, forcing them to abandon their vehicles and proceed on foot, exactly as planned. Sullivan allowed himself a moment to appreciate the irony. The cartel had come expecting to overwhelm a single old rancher. Instead, they'd walked into an operation planned and executed by some of the most experienced combat veterans still breathing. A burst of gunfire shattered windows in the ranch house, showering glass across pre-evacuated rooms. Sullivan had already moved to his next position. The timing of his relocations, practiced over countless nights. Every shadow, every angle of approach had been measured, evaluated, and prepared for. "Sierra team, status," he called, taking out another cartel member who had strayed too far from cover. "3 tangos down," came the response from a former Marine sniper positioned in the hills. 2 more pinned behind the dead vehicles. These boys aren't used to fighting. People who shoot back properly. Martinez was proving to be more resilient than expected. He'd organized his remaining men into something resembling a defensive position, using the disabled vehicles as cover. "Who are you people?" he shouted into the darkness. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Sullivan's reply was another precise shot, this one destroying Martinez's radio. The message was clear. They knew exactly what they were dealing with. "Boss," Chen's voice had an edge of concern. "We've got movement at the Henderson's place. Looks like they're mobilizing their entire force." This was the moment Sullivan had been waiting for. "Jenkins, light up the sky." Multiple illumination rounds arced into the air, bathing the battlefield in harsh white light. The cartel members found themselves fully exposed, their tactical positions suddenly vulnerable from multiple angles. "Last chance," Sullivan broadcast, his voice carried by hidden speakers around the property. "Surrender now, and you get to explain to your bosses how you walked into a trap. Continue fighting, and you won't be explaining anything to anyone." The response came in the form of renewed gunfire, but the confidence was gone from their actions. These men were used to being the apex predators, not the prey. "Have it your way," Sullivan sighed. "All teams, weapons free. Show them what retired professionals can do." The next 3 minutes were a demonstration of why some veterans never really leave the war behind. They just wait for it to catch up. Coordinated fire from multiple positions systematically eliminated any hope of organized resistance. Chen's demolitions expertise turned escape routes into death traps. Jenkins' heavy weapons team kept reinforcements at bay with devastating precision. Martinez, to his credit, recognized the inevitable. "Hold fire!" he screamed, dropping his weapon. "Hold fire! Sullivan moved through the shadows, approaching the cartel leader with the same deadly grace he'd possessed decades ago. Martinez found himself staring down the barrel of a rifle held by a man old enough to be his father, but whose eyes held the unmistakable hardness of someone who had dealt death in the world's darkest places. "You should have done your homework," Sullivan said quietly. "Asked around about who you were trying to push out, made some calls, checked some backgrounds." Each word carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned in places where mistakes meant death. "We'll be back," Martinez threatened, though his voice lacked conviction. "The cartel doesn't forget." "No," Sullivan agreed. "They don't. That's why what happens next is so important." He keyed his radio. "Chen, show them what we found at the Henderson place." Drone footage began broadcasting to a tablet Sullivan held up. Detailed images of the cartel's local operation, including faces, license plates, and most importantly, evidence of their political connections. Amazing what you can document when people think they're the only ones watching. Martinez's face went pale. "That's not possible." "We had security." "You had amateurs," Sullivan corrected. "Playing at being soldiers. My team? We've been ghost hunting since before you were born. Everything you've done here, everyone you've paid off, every route you've planned, we've documented it all." "Why show me this?" Sullivan's smile was cold. "Because you're going to deliver a message. Everything we've collected gets sent to 3 different agencies if anything happens to the local ranchers. Any suspicious accidents, any mysterious fires, any unexplained disappearances, it all goes public. And not just here. We've mapped your entire northern corridor." "You're bluffing," Martinez managed, but his eyes showed doubt. "Am I?" Sullivan nodded to Chen, who emerged from the shadows. The former demolitions expert handed Martinez a phone showing more footage, operations across 3 states, all meticulously documented. "Like I said, you should have done your homework. We've been watching you build this network for months. Did you really think you were the only ones who could build a surveillance operation?" In the distance, sirens began to wail. Right on schedule, Sullivan thought. The local police chief might be compromised, but the state police weren't. An anonymous tip about gunfire and possible cartel activity would bring them running and create an official record of tonight's events. "You have a choice," Sullivan continued. "Take this lesson back to your bosses. Explain that this territory is now under protection, not from one old rancher, but from a network of veterans who've spent their lives dealing with people exactly like you. We're not looking for a war." He paused meaningfully. "But we're very, very good at fighting them." Martinez looked around at his defeated men, at the precision with which they'd been systematically taken apart. "And if we refuse?" "Then the next time won't be a warning," Sullivan said simply. "We won't disable engines or fire warning shots. We won't offer chances to surrender. We'll simply eliminate the problem with extreme prejudice. And all that evidence, it won't go to law enforcement." His voice hardened. "It'll go to your competitors." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Every cartel member knew what would happen if rival organizations got detailed intelligence about their operations. It would be a death sentence more certain than any government raid. "You have 30 minutes to collect your wounded and leave," Sullivan concluded. "The state police will be here in 40. I suggest you use that time wisely." As the cartel members began their humiliating withdrawal, Sullivan keyed his radio one final time. "All teams, maintain overwatch. Make sure our friends don't get any last-minute ideas about heroics." Chen materialized beside him, watching the retreat. "Think they'll really back off?" "They don't have a choice," Sullivan replied. "We didn't just beat them. We showed them how completely we've compromised their operation. They'll have to assume we've done the same thing everywhere they're trying to expand." "And have we?" Sullivan's smile was tired but satisfied. "Let's just say I haven't been completely idle in retirement. Those old surveillance networks we used to run, they work just as well against cartels as they did against insurgents." The sound of vehicles starting up and driving away filled the night. Sullivan watched them go, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and dialed Miguel's number. "It's done," he said simply. "You can bring your family home. Anyone hurt on our side?" "Negative. Everything went according to plan." Sullivan paused. "But Miguel, get your family inside quick. State police will be here soon, and there's a lot of brass to police up before they arrive." As his team began the efficient process of erasing evidence of their more questionable tactical choices, Sullivan allowed himself to feel the weight of his years. His body ached from the evening's exertions, old wounds complaining about the activity. But his mind was sharp, focused. Tonight had been a reminder of why he'd never fully retired, never completely put away the skills that had defined his life. The cartel had made a fundamental mistake. They'd seen an old man living alone and assumed he was vulnerable. They hadn't understood that some warriors don't age. They just get more dangerous. Experience doesn't fade. Networks don't disappear. And the will to protect what's yours, that never retires. Sullivan looked out over his land, now quiet except for the distant sound of sirens growing closer. The ranch had been his refuge, his attempt at a peaceful retirement. Now it had become something else. A statement, a line in the sand, a reminder that some battles don't end just because you're tired of fighting them. He touched the wedding ring he still wore, thinking of Sarah. "Sorry, love," he murmured. "Looks like peaceful retirement's going to have to wait a little longer." Somewhere, he thought he could hear her laughing. She'd always said he was terrible at retiring. The first state police vehicles were visible now, their lights painting the desert in red and blue. Sullivan straightened his clothes, preparing to play the role of a frightened old rancher who'd been lucky to survive a cartel attack. His team would be gone, leaving no trace of their presence. The official report would show a failed intimidation attempt, nothing more. But the real message had been sent. The cartel would learn, as so many others had over the years, that appearances could be deceiving. Sometimes the most dangerous predators were the ones that looked harmless. And sometimes the best way to win a war was to make your enemies realize they didn't want to fight it in the first place. Dawn crept over Sullivan's ranch like a weary soldier, painting the aftermath of last night's firefight in shades of gold and shadow. Brass casings glinted in the early light, each one a reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. Sullivan sat at his kitchen table, the rich aroma of fresh coffee mixing with the lingering scent of cordite, while Chen and Jenkins arranged their gear with practiced efficiency. "They'll hit back," Jenkins said, his fingers dancing across his laptop keyboard as he monitored local police channels. Cartels don't take humiliation well. His cybersecurity background showed in the way he'd already tapped into every digital network within 50 miles, creating an invisible web of surveillance. Chen nodded, methodically cleaning his weapons despite having done so hours earlier. The demolition expert's hands moved with surgical precision, each motion born from decades of experience. Question is, how? These aren't common thugs. They've got resources, training. Sullivan studied satellite imagery on his own computer, his weathered face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. Maps and tactical overlays reflected in his eyes as he traced potential approach routes, marking likely observation posts. "They'll adapt," he said quietly. "Professional outfits always do. This wasn't just about intimidation. They're building something bigger." A knock at the door interrupted their planning. Sullivan checked the security feed, a habit ingrained by years of operational security. Before admitting Miguel and Maria Ortiz, Maria immediately shifted into nurse mode, her experienced eyes scanning Sullivan for injuries he might have concealed. "Don't bother denying it," she said, pulling medical supplies from her bag. "I know you too well, Jack Sullivan." Her hands were gentle but insistent as she found the graze on his arm, cleaning it despite his protests. Miguel moved to the tactical displays, his rancher's calloused hands tracing the same routes Sullivan had been studying. "State police are calling it a failed home invasion," he reported. "No mentions of cartel involvement. Local news is playing it down." "Good," Sullivan grunted, wincing slightly as Maria applied antiseptic. "Better if they think it was random. Keeps the official attention minimal." He nodded toward Jenkins' laptop. "What are you seeing?" Jenkins's face was illuminated by multiple screens, each showing different data streams. "They're pulling back," he reported, pointing to thermal imaging feeds. 3 properties within 50 miles showing major movement. Vehicles, personnel, equipment, all being consolidated. "See?" Sullivan's voice carried a hint of grim satisfaction. "Professionals. They're adjusting their tactical posture, strengthening core positions." His finger traced several locations on the digital map. "They'll focus their resources here, here, and here. Defensible terrain, good observation points, multiple exfil routes." Miguel leaned closer to the displays, hope creeping into his voice. "They're retreating. We won." "No," Chen cut in, understanding dawning in his eyes. "This isn't retreat, it's redeployment. They're not running away, They're preparing for something else. Sullivan nodded, his expression hardening. Exactly. We hurt their reputation last night. In their world, that's worse than losing men or materials. He zoomed in on one particular property, a recently purchased ranch that overlooked several key transit routes. They'll want payback, but not how we expect. They're professionals. They'll look for angles we haven't considered. Maria finished bandaging Sullivan's arm, her touch professional but concerned. The festival, she said suddenly, making everyone turn. Next week, the whole town will be there. Vendors, families, tourists. Sullivan's face remained impassive, but his eyes showed he'd already considered this possibility. Perfect target for sending a message, he agreed quietly. Maximum visibility, minimal security, lots of civilians, classic terror tactics. They wouldn't, Miguel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Not with children present. They would, Sullivan corrected grimly. I've seen it before, in places where the rules didn't apply. Make everyone so afraid that resistance becomes unthinkable. He pulled up building plans and street layouts for the festival grounds. But that's where they'll make their mistake. How so? Chen asked, moving to study the plans. Sullivan's smile was cold, predatory. Because they think like criminals trying to be soldiers. We think like soldiers who've hunted criminals. He began marking key positions on the map. They'll want witnesses, for whatever they're planning. Need to be seen, need to make their statement, which means they'll have to expose themselves, Jenkins finished, already typing new commands into his system. I can have facial recognition running on every camera in town. If they show up. When, Sullivan corrected. Not if. They have to now. Their whole operational model depends on fear. If they let us humiliate them again, other ranchers will resist. Other communities will fight back. His eyes had that focused look his team recognized from countless past operations. So they'll come to the festival. They'll treat to remind everyone why the cartel should be feared. And we'll be ready, Chen stated with quiet confidence. The cartel's response came 3 days later, not with guns and violence, but with a briefcase and a stack of legal documents. The courier who delivered them wore an expensive suit and carried a bar association card, a far cry from the tactical gear of their previous visitors. Water rights violations, Miguel explained, spreading the papers across Sullivan's study. The morning sun streamed through bulletproof windows, illuminating dense paragraphs of legal terminology. They're claiming we're illegally diverting water from properties they represent. 3 different law firms involved. Sullivan studied the documents while Chen and Jenkins monitored their surveillance feeds. The study had become a command center, with multiple screens showing thermal imaging, satellite feeds, and data analysis. Military-grade equipment hidden behind the facade of a simple rancher's office. Smart play, Sullivan admitted, his finger tracing a particular clause. They're using the system against us, trying to drain our resources with legal battles, while they prepare for something bigger. He moved to a wall-mounted map, where red pins marked properties recently purchased by cartel-linked shell companies. Look at the pattern. Jenkins looked up from his laptop, his face illuminated by multiple screens. They're not just filing water rights, claims, environmental impact complaints, property line challenges, questions about your original ranch purchase. It's a full-court press. They've got teams of lawyers working on this. Can they win? Miguel asked, worry creasing his face. The morning light caught the grey in his hair, making him look older than his 50 years. Sullivan moved to his secure satellite phone, a piece of equipment that looked out of place among the ranch house decor. Not if I can help it. His fingers moved across the keypad, dialing numbers he hadn't used in years. Time to activate another kind of network. Over the next hour, Sullivan made calls to contacts scattered across the country, former intelligence analysts who'd become corporate lawyers, retired JAG officers who owed him favors from classified operations. Each call added another layer to their counter-strategy, another resource to draw upon. 3 law firms willing to take our case pro bono, he announced finally, setting down the phone. Specialists in property rights and environmental law, and Judge Davidson. Turns out he's been tracking cartel legal strategies for years. Says these kinds of cases come across his desk all the time. Chen grinned, looking up from his equipment maintenance. The cartel's not the only one with friends in high places, but Sullivan's expression remained grave as he studied thermal imaging feeds. This is just their opening move. While we're tied up with paperwork, they're setting up observation posts. Professional coverage, well concealed. He pointed to several heat signatures that most people would have missed. See those patterns? Those aren't random campers. Jenkins manipulated his surveillance feeds, zooming in on different locations. 6 different positions identified, all with clear lines of sight to both ranches. They're studying our routines, looking for patterns. Let them look, Sullivan said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. We'll give them patterns to study. Over the next week, Sullivan's team established carefully crafted routines, regular patrols that seemed random but actually followed specific protocols, supply runs that appeared vulnerable but were secretly coordinated with other veterans in the area. Every movement was designed to project an image of organized but limited defense. We're letting them think they've got us figured out, Sullivan explained during a secure briefing with his core team. The evening sun cast long shadows through the study windows as they gathered around the tactical displays. That's why we haven't responded to their surveillance. Let them think their legal strategy has you spinned down, focusing on paperwork instead of security. But beneath the surface, Sullivan's real operation was growing. More veterans arrived, taking up positions throughout the region. Equipment was cached in strategic locations. Intelligence networks were activated, monitoring cartel communications and movements. They're getting confident, Chen reported one evening, his thermal imaging equipment revealing sloppy tradecraft from the surveillance teams, breaking basic protocols, leaving obvious traces. Sullivan nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the command center. They think we're amateurs who got lucky, that we're busy with lawyers instead of watching them. He checked his watch, thanked his radio. Time to remind them why that's a dangerous assumption. The operation began at midnight, when the desert air was coldest and thermal imaging worked best. 6 teams moving simultaneously, each comprised of veterans who'd spent decades perfecting the art of remaining unseen. No shots fired, no violence, just the silent efficiency of professionals who had never really stopped being dangerous. Target 1 secured, came the first report, whispered into encrypted comms. 2 tangos detained, equipment seized. Similar reports followed in rapid succession. Each cartel surveillance post was neutralized with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The observers never had a chance to warn their superiors. Final position clear, Chen's voice crackled over the radio. You should see their faces, boss. These boys look like they've seen ghosts. Sullivan's reply was cold, professional. They have. Bag everything. I want their equipment, their communications, their orders, everything. Full intel sweep. The intelligence harvest proved more valuable than they'd anticipated. The cartel's surveillance teams had been thorough in their documentation, providing Sullivan's team with detailed insights into their wider operation. This is bigger than we thought, Jenkins said, analyzing the captured data. Multiple screens showed financial records, shipping schedules, personnel rosters. They've got backup teams staged throughout the region. This isn't just about pushing us out. They're building infrastructure. Sullivan studied the information grimly, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. Look at these construction plans. These ranches they've bought. They're not just transit points. They're building a distribution hub, something permanent. Miguel leaned forward, his face pale in the artificial light. How deep does this go? Deep enough that we need to change our strategy, Sullivan replied, manipulating the digital displays. They're not just trying to force us out anymore. They're building something that could destroy this entire region. His fingers traced routes on the tactical map. If they succeed, every ranch, every town within 100 miles becomes cartel territory. The captured cartel operators were released, with a carefully crafted message. Everything they'd gathered had been compromised. Their entire operational security was blown. And if they continued their expansion, every piece of intelligence would be sent to their rivals. They'll have to assume we know everything, Chen said, cleaning his gear with mechanical precision. Their whole northern corridor is now suspect. Sullivan nodded, his expression grim. Which means they'll have to clean house, pull back, reorganize. It buys us time. He turned to his team. But not much. This isn't over. It's just moving to the next phase. What next phase? Miguel asked, worry evident in his voice. Think about it, Sullivan said, pulling up new satellite imagery. We've hurt them twice now, made them look weak. In their world, that's worse than any financial loss. He studied the EI surveillance data with the focus of a predator. They'll have to respond dramatically. something big enough to restore their reputation. The festival, Maria whispered from where she'd been quietly listening. All eyes turned to her. Next week, the whole town will be celebrating the harvest. Everyone will be there. Sullivan cursed softly. She was right. A public target, maximum visibility, minimal security, perfect for sending a message that would resonate throughout the region. They wouldn't, Miguel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Not with civilians. They would, Sullivan interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of experience. I've seen it before, in places where the rules didn't apply. Terror tactics. Make everyone so afraid that no one dares to resist. He began, pulling up building plans, street layouts, but that's where they'll make their mistake. How so? Chen asked, moving to study the plans. Because they think like criminals trying to be soldiers. We think like soldiers who've hunted criminals. Sullivan's eyes had that focused look his team recognized from countless operations. They'll want to make a statement. That means they'll need to be visible, need witnesses. They'll have to expose themselves. Jenkins was already typing commands into his system. I can have facial recognition running on every camera in town. Chen's demo team can pre-position countermeasures if they show up. Not if, Sullivan corrected. When? They have to now. Their whole operational model depends on fear. If they let us humiliate them again, other ranchers will resist. Other communities will fight back. He smiled coldly. So they'll come to the festival. They'll try to remind everyone why the cartel should be feared. And we'll be ready, Chen finished, his voice carrying quiet confidence. The next few days were a flurry of preparation. Sullivan's network expanded further, bringing in more veterans, more resources. The town's festival grounds became a carefully prepared battlefield, though none of the locals would ever know it. Everything's in position, Chen reported the night before the festival. Demo teams have rigged every approach. Jenkins has eyes on all digital communications. Sniper teams have coverage of every major intersection. Sullivan checked his weapons one final time, muscle memory from thousands of similar preparations taking over. Remember, we're not just stopping an attack. We're ending their presence here permanently. After tomorrow, they need to understand that this territory is off limits. You think they'll finally learn? Miguel asked, worry evident in his voice. Sullivan's smile was predatory. Oh, they'll learn. The cartels understand one thing above all else. Cost versus benefit. By tomorrow night, the cost of operating here will be too high to justify the benefit. He checked his watch. Get some rest. Tomorrow we remind them why some legends are best left alone. As his team dispersed to their positions, Sullivan stood on his porch, watching the desert night. He thought about Sarah, about the peaceful retirement they'd planned. Sorry, love, he murmured. One last operation, then maybe I can finally keep that promise about settling down. The night wind carried no reply, but Sullivan felt a familiar calm settling over him. Tomorrow would bring violence, yes, but also resolution. One final battle to protect his home, his friends, his way of life. The cartel was about to learn the hard way that some old soldiers never stop being dangerous. They just get better at picking their battles. In his command center, the screens continued their silent vigil, showing heat signatures moving through the darkness. Tomorrow would decide everything, and Jack Sullivan, veteran of 100 silent wars, intended to make it a lesson the cartel would never forget. The morning of the festival dawned bright and clear, the desert air crisp with autumn's first bite. Sullivan stood in his command center, watching multiple screens as the town came to life. Vendors setting up stalls, families arriving with excited children, everything appearing normal to casual observers. All teams report in, he commanded, over the encrypted channel. Alpha team in position, northwest corner. Bravo covering main entrance. Charlie team on overwatch, Al approach is clear. Delta standing by with QRF. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then his secure phone rang. A line known to only his most trusted contacts. The caller ID showed a number he hadn't seen in years. William Hayes, his former handler from his CIA days. Hayes? This is unexpected. Jack, thank God. Hayes's voice carried an urgency Sullivan hadn't heard since their active days. You've got a problem. A big one. Sullivan's instincts, honed by decades of operations, instantly went on alert. Talk to me. Remember Operation Shadowfall? Afghanistan, 2005. Sullivan's blood ran cold. That operation was supposed to be buried so deep, even God couldn't find it. What about it? Someone's trying to use it. Just intercepted chatter. The cartel's got pictures, documents, witnesses. They're going to expose everything at the festival today. Make it all public. Sullivan's mind raced. Shadowfall had been the darkest operation of his career. A mission that had saved thousands of lives, but required choices that would destroy him if they ever came to light. How? He demanded. Those files were buried. The witnesses are dead. Or... He stopped, realization dawning. Unless someone who was there kept insurance, Hayes finished grimly. Someone who knew everything. Sullivan closed his eyes, decades-old memories surfacing. Marcus. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. Marcus Kane. Got it in one. Your old second-in-command just made contact with the cartel. He's been holding on to evidence all these years, waiting for the right moment. They're paying him a fortune to destroy you. Sullivan's tactical mind was already spinning through implications. If Shadowfall became public, it wouldn't just destroy him. It would compromise dozens of ongoing operations worldwide. Agents would die. Networks would collapse. And locally, the revelation would destroy any credibility his team had built, making the entire region vulnerable to cartel takeover. Hayes, Sullivan's voice was deadly calm. How long? Hours at most. Kane's already in the area. The cartel's planning some kind of public revelation at the festival. Maximum exposure. Send me everything you've got. Now. As the files came through, Sullivan studied them with growing concern. Kane had been thorough. Photos, documents, video testimony. Everything needed to prove what really happened during those dark days in the Hindu Kush. Chen, Sullivan called over the radio. We've got a complication. Chapter 8. Ghosts of the Past. The festival was in full swing when Marcus Kane arrived. At 65, he still moved with the deadly grace that had made him one of the CIA's top operators. His silver hair and expensive suit helped him blend perfectly with the town's wealthier visitors. Sullivan watched through surveillance feeds as his former friend made his way through the crowds. Kane wasn't alone. Cartel's security teams moved, with him, professionally spaced, well-armed under casual clothes. What's the play, boss? Chen asked quietly. We're set up to stop a show of force, not this. Sullivan's face was granite. Kane knows all our old playbooks. He helped write them. We need to change the game. He studied the festival layout. Jenkins, you still have that media kill switch ready. Set up to black out all communications if needed. But Jack, if we do that, I know, we'll look like the bad guys. Kane's counting on us trying to stop him, using our intervention to prove his point. Sullivan's mind worked through scenarios with mechanical precision. He wants us to play defense, so we don't, sir. We go offensive, right now. Very publicly. I walk right up to him. Chen's eyes widened. That's suicide. The cartel's got at least 20 shooters in the crowd. Exactly. And they can't use them without exposing themselves. Kane's plan only works if I try to stop him secretly, if I make it public first. Sullivan smiled grimly. He loses his leverage. Jack, Miguel's voice was worried through the radio. What aren't you telling us about this operation he's threatening to expose? Sullivan's pause was heavy. Nothing you want to know, my friend, but I've got a plan. Chen, get your demo team ready. Jenkins, prepare for electronic warfare, but don't initiate until I give the signal. Everyone else, maintain positions, but do not, I repeat, do not engage unless I give the order. Sullivan checked his concealed weapon, more from habit than necessity. Kane thinks he knows me. Knows how I'll react. He's remembering the man I was 20 years ago. Time to show him who I am now. The festival grounds were packed with families, the air filled with music and the smell of food. Sullivan moved through the crowd with purposeful steps, watching Kane's security detail tense as they spotted him. The two old warriors came face to face near the central pavilion. Kane's smile was genuine, if predatory. Jack, you're looking well for a man your age. Marcus, still fighting other people's battles, I see. Kane's eyes hardened slightly. Sometimes the best battles are the ones where you can choose your side. You taught me that, remember? Hindu Kush, 2005. I remember a lot of things about 2005, Sullivan replied evenly, including why we did what we did. Ah, but does everyone else? Kane gestured subtly at the crowds. All these nice people, living their simple lives. What would they think if they knew what their friendly local rancher did in those mountains? Sullivan's voice remained calm. You really want to find out, because I'm ready to tell them. All of it. Right here, right now. That rocked Kane back slightly. You're bluffing. Am I? You know me, Marcus. Know how I think. What I've done. You really think I haven't planned for this day? Sullivan's smile was cold. Look around. Really look. Kane's practiced eyes scanned the crowd, finally seeing what Sullivan wanted him to see. Veterans scattered throughout, positioned perfectly. Surveillance equipment covering every angle, and most importantly, multiple news cameras that had just happened to be in position. You set this up, Kane realized. You knew I was coming. I knew someone was coming. You taught me too well about having contingency plans. Sullivan's voice carried across the growing quiet. So here's how this plays out. You can release your evidence. I'll release mine. Everything comes out, including who really gave the orders that day and why. Kane's face went still. You wouldn't. It would burn everything. Everyone. I'm 72 years old, Marcus. My wife is gone. My service is done. The only things I care about now are this land and these people. You really think I won't burn down the whole damn world to protect them? The festival crowd had gone quiet, sensing the tension between these two old men. Kane's security detail looked uncertain, hands straying toward hidden weapons. The cartel won't let this go, Kane warned quietly. They've invested too much. The cartel? Sullivan laughed softly. Look at your phone, Marcus. Look at what's happening to their accounts right now. Kane did, his face paling slightly. Jenkins's cyber team had been busy, following electronic trails, documenting transactions, including Kane's payments. You think I spent the last 20 years just ranching? Sullivan's voice was almost gentle. I learned new tricks, adapted, changed. You're still playing the old game, Marcus. I'm playing a different one entirely. The sound of police sirens grew in the distance. Kane's security teams began melting away, recognizing a battle lost before it began. It's over, Sullivan said quietly. Take your evidence and go. But remember, you try to use it again, everything comes out. Everything. And neither of us wants that. Kane studied his old commander for a long moment. You've changed, Jack. No, Marcus. I just finally learned what's worth fighting for. Sullivan turned away, then paused. The Hindu Kush was a long time ago. Let it stay there. As Kane departed, Sullivan keyed his radio. All teams, stand down. Threat neutralized. He watched his old friend disappear into the crowd, carrying secrets that would stay buried for another day. The festival slowly returned to life around him, families and children enjoying their day, unaware of how close they'd come to tragedy. Sullivan felt every one of his years as he made his way back to his command post. You want to tell us what really happened in 2005? Chen asked quietly. Sullivan shook his head. No, you don't want those ghosts. Some secrets deserve to stay buried. He checked his monitors, watching Kane's vehicle leave town. But now we know something important. The cartel's desperate. They're doing research, digging up old operations, which means they're scared of you, Jenkins finished. Not just me. Us. This whole operation. Sullivan allowed himself a grim smile. They tried to use my past against me. Instead, they just proved how far they'll go to try to stop us. Which means we're winning. The festival continued around them, but Sullivan's mind was already moving to the next phase. The cartel had shown their hand, revealed their desperation. Now it was time to press the advantage. Chen, get the teams ready. Jenkins, keep tracking those financial transfers. The cartel just gave us a gift, proof of their methods, their contacts, their desperation. Time to use it. As his team moved to their tasks, Sullivan watched the families enjoying their festival. He'd protected his secrets today, but more importantly, he'd protected these people. Sometimes, he reflected, the best victories are the ones the public never knows about. The morning after the festival brought an eerie calm to Sullivan's ranch. The command center, converted from his study months ago, hummed with the quiet efficiency of professional surveillance equipment. Multiple screens cast their blue glow across faces hardened by years of covert operations, each display telling part of a larger story of impending conflict. They're moving money, Jenkins reported, his fingers dancing across 3 keyboards simultaneously. The former NSA cyber specialist hadn't slept, tracking electronic trails through the digital underground. Not just moving it, they're burning. They're legitimate covers. Look at these patterns. Sullivan leaned closer to the main display, his weathered face reflected in the screen. Years of experience reading intelligence reports helped him see the larger picture forming. These aren't normal transfers, he noted, pointing to specific transactions. They're liquidating their legal holdings, converting everything to untraceable assets. That's preparation for war. Chen moved from his own monitoring station, thermal imaging feeds painting his face in ghostly colors. Got movement at 3 properties, boss. Heavy vehicles, professional security teams, nothing local. He manipulated the imagery, highlighting specific heat signatures. These guys move like military, special forces, maybe private contractors. Makes sense, Sullivan nodded, his voice carrying the weight of decades in the shadows. They tried subtle with their legal attacks. They tried leverage with Kane and Shadowfall. Now they'll do what they know best. Overwhelming force. He paused, studying the patterns of movement. But they'll be smart about it. Professional. No more midnight raids or thuggish intimidation. Miguel entered the command center carrying fresh coffee, the rich aroma cutting through the tension. Local intelligence came with the caffeine. Town's buzzing about yesterday. Nobody knows exactly what happened with you and that businessman, but rumors are flying. Some say cartel, some say government. Nobody's sure what to believe. What's the overall mood? Sullivan asked, accepting a cup with a nod of thanks. Mixed, Miguel replied, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. Some folks are scared, thinking big trouble's coming, but others... A slight smile crossed his face. Others are saying maybe the cartels aren't as untouchable as everyone thought. That maybe they can be stood up to. Sullivan's expression hardened, lines deepening around his eyes. That's exactly what I was afraid of. The cartel can't let that idea take root. Hope is dangerous to their business model. He turned to the tactical displays, manipulating maps with practiced efficiency. They'll have to respond dramatically, make an example so brutal that no one ever thinks about resistance again. How long do you think we have? Chen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Not long, Sullivan replied grimly. They'll want to coordinate their show of force with their legal moves, maximize the impact. Probably waiting. On some official cover. Building permits, health inspections, something to give them legitimate presence in the area. As if on cue, Miguel spoke up. Maria called earlier. Local clinic just got notice of a surprise inspection. State officials, supposedly coming tomorrow morning. Sullivan's eyes narrowed as another piece fell into place. There it is. Their first move. They'll use the inspection to plant people inside the town, coordinating with teams moving in from outside. He turned to his command screens. Jenkins, get me everything you can on these inspectors. Chen, I want round-the-clock surveillance on every approach road. Miguel. He paused, weight in his voice. Get your family out of town. Tonight. Jack, I can't just... Don't argue. You know what's coming. Sullivan's tone left no room for debate. Get them somewhere safe. We'll need you here. But they shouldn't be anywhere near this when it goes down. As Miguel reluctantly departed, Sullivan gathered his core team. The command center felt smaller with everyone crowded around the main tactical display. We've got maybe 48 hours before they move. Time to spring our own surprises. Chen raised an eyebrow. The contingency plans? All of them. Sullivan pulled up new tactical overlays, each representing carefully prepared countermeasures. They think they know our capabilities, our positions. Time to show them how wrong they are. Through the night, Sullivan's network hummed with careful activity. Veterans who'd been hiding in plain sight throughout the region began moving to predetermined positions. Equipment cached months ago was retrieved and deployed. An invisible web of defense and counterattack began taking shape. Remember, Sullivan briefed his team leaders in the pre-dawn hours. We're not just fighting cartel soldiers. These will be professionals, experienced in urban combat. They'll have tech, tactics, and numbers on their side. So what's our advantage? Someone asked from the back of the room. Sullivan's smile was cold, predatory. They're fighting to control territory. We're fighting for our homes, and we've been preparing for this exact scenario for months. He gestured to the tactical displays. They think they're hunting us. Time to show them what it feels like to be the prey. Dawn brought the first visible signs of the coming storm. Black SUVs carrying state inspectors arrived at the clinic, their occupants moving with the too precise efficiency that screamed military training to experienced eyes. Simultaneously, Multiple construction crews appeared at strategic points around town, their heavy equipment providing perfect cover for weapons and personnel. Sullivan watched it all through his surveillance network, coordinating responses from his command center. Each screen told part of a story that only veterans like him could read completely. Classic infiltration pattern, he noted, pointing out specific movements to his team. Look how they're positioning their assets. Each team has overlapping fields of fire, multiple escape routes. This isn't cartel work, this is professional military planning. Very professional, Chen agreed, studying thermal imaging feeds showing the heat signatures of hidden weapons and communications equipment. These aren't ordinary cartel muscle. Military background, probably top-tier contractors. Look at how they maintain spacing, how they check sightlines. Mercenaries, Sullivan corrected grimly. Expensive ones. Which means whatever they're planning, it's going to be bigger than anything we've seen before. He keyed his radio. All teams, maintain cover. Let them think they're being subtle. Let them think they have surprise. Throughout the day, more pieces of the cartel's plan became visible to those who knew what to look for. Building inspectors appeared at key businesses. Health department teams visited restaurants. Each group perfectly legitimate on paper, each carrying hidden purposes that Sullivan's surveillance caught in telling details. Subtle hand signals, concealed communications equipment, weapons hidden under official-looking jackets. They're establishing a presence, Sullivan explained to his team leaders during an encrypted video conference, creating valid reasons for their people to be in position when everything goes down. Manipulated, the tactical displays highlighting various locations. See the pattern? They're setting up a grid. When they move, they'll be able to lock down the entire town in minutes. Classic special operations tactic. Jenkins looked up from his cyber monitoring station, concern etched on his face. Getting spikes in encrypted communications. Heavy traffic, but it's all compartmentalized. Each team only knows their piece of the operation. Very professional OPSEC. Smart, Sullivan nodded. Professional respect in his voice. Limits potential leaks. Classic special operations protocol. His eyes narrowed as he studied communication patterns. Which means they've got someone with serious military experience running this operation. Someone who knows all the old playbooks. As if in response to his words, a new alert flashed across Jenkins's screen. Movement at the old airfield. Private jet just landed. No flight plan filed, but it's a high-end military spec aircraft. The surveillance feed showed a figure emerging from the jet. Tall, athletic despite his years, moving with the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier. Sullivan's face hardened as recognition hit. Old memories surfacing like sharks in dark water. Colonel James Morrison, he said quietly, the name carrying weight even after all these years. Should have known they'd bring him in for something this big. You know him? Chen asked, noting the tension in Sullivan's voice. Everybody in our world knows Morrison. Former Delta Force commander turned private military contractor. His company provides security services to cartels across 3 continents. Sullivan's voice carried grudging respect, mixed with cold calculation. He's good. Very good. The kind of good that means whatever they're planning just got a lot more complicated. How good are we talking? Jenkins asked, already pulling up what digital records existed on Morrison. Good enough that if he's here personally, this operation is bigger than anything we anticipated. Sullivan began modifying tactical displays, adding new contingencies. Morrison doesn't do small operations. He specializes in complete takeovers, eliminating all resistance so thoroughly that nobody ever thinks about fighting back. I saw his work in South America. When he's finished with a town, it's not just conquered, it's transformed. The implications hung heavy in the command center. If the cartel had brought in Morrison and his team, they weren't just planning to make an example of the town. They were planning to own it completely, to make it a permanent base for their operations. Options, Chen asked quietly, the single word carrying the weight of years of operational experience. Sullivan studied the tactical situation with the focus of a predator assessing prey. Morrison's teams were professional, well-equipped, and positioned perfectly. A direct confrontation would be suicide. But as he watched Morrison coordinate with his team leaders, a plan began forming. Morrison's good, Sullivan said finally, but he's got one weakness. He thinks like a soldier, not a spy. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. He'll be expecting us to defend, to react, to follow conventional tactical responses. Instead, we attack first, Chen finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. Exactly. But not how he'll expect. Sullivan began marking new positions on their tactical displays, each point representing a carefully prepared surprise. Morrison's planning a coordinated takeover, probably scheduled for tomorrow night. Multiple teams hitting multiple targets simultaneously. Overwhelming force, shock, and awe, total dominance. It's his signature move. How do we stop it? Jenkins asked, fingers hovering over his keyboards. We don't. Sullivan's smile grew colder. We let him execute exactly as planned. But when his teams move, he pointed to positions throughout the town, places where veterans had been quietly preparing for months. They'll find out why you don't bring soldiers to fight ghosts. Through the afternoon and evening, Sullivan's network executed his orders with precision, born of decades of experience. Unexpected equipment failures plagued the cartel's construction sites. Communications experienced mysterious interference. Small, but crucial pieces of their operation began to malfunction or disappear. Death by 1,000 cuts, Sullivan explained to his team as they watched Morrison's growing frustration through surveillance feeds. We're not trying to stop them. We're making them doubt their own operation, creating uncertainty. In Morrison's world, uncertainty gets people killed. By nightfall, Morrison's frustration was visible even through thermal imaging. His teams were reporting equipment failures, communications issues, missing supplies. Small problems, but they were adding up, creating delays and doubts in an operation that required perfect coordination. He's too professional to abort, Sullivan noted, watching Morrison coordinate with his team leaders in an impromptu meeting. But he's starting to worry, starting to wonder what he's missing. In his mind, these aren't random problems anymore. They're patterns he can't quite see. Will it be enough to stop him? Jenkins asked, monitoring Morrison's encrypted communications. Sullivan's expression was grim but determined. No, but it's not supposed to be. We're not trying to stop tomorrow night's operation. We're setting the stage for what happens after it fails. He stood, checking his own equipment with the careful precision of someone who had learned hard lessons about preparation. As darkness fell, the town seemed peaceful on the surface, but beneath that calm, two invisible armies were preparing for battle. Morrison's mercenaries, professional and well-equipped, preparing to execute a takeover operation they'd performed successfully dozens of times before. Each team knew their role, each position carefully chosen, each contingency planned for, and Sullivan's veterans, hidden in plain sight, preparing to teach them why some battles can't be won with conventional tactics. Tomorrow night would determine not just the fate of the town, but whether any cartel would ever dare to move against them again. Sullivan made one final check of his preparations, then keyed his radio. All teams, maintain position. Tomorrow, we remind Colonel Morrison why some of us were ghosts long before he learned to soldier. His voice carried quiet confidence earned through decades of impossible operations. The night settled over the town like a held breath, waiting for the storm to break. In his command center, Sullivan watched Morrison's teams make their final preparations, knowing that tomorrow would bring either victory or annihilation. There would be no middle ground, no room for partial success. Some battles, he murmured to himself, touching the wedding ring he still wore. You win by fighting. Others you win by making the enemy defeat himself. Tomorrow, Morrison would learn which kind of battle he'd walked into, and Sullivan would remind everyone why some old soldiers never truly retire. They just wait for the right moment to show why they became legends in the first place. The day of Morrison's planned operation dawned with an unseasonal chill, as if nature itself sensed the coming violence. Sullivan stood on his porch at first light, watching his breath mist in the cold air while monitoring radio traffic through his concealed earpiece. Around the town, Morrison's teams were making their final preparations, each movement precise and professional. All units verify positions. Morrison's voice crackled through their intercepted communications. The colonel's tone was crisp, commanding, the voice of someone used to orchestrating complex military operations. I want confirmation of all assets within the next 30 minutes. Sullivan allowed himself a grim smile. Morrison was good, running a textbook special operations setup, but he was playing by rules, written for a different kind of war. Inside the command center, Chen and Jenkins coordinated their own preparations. Multiple screens showed thermal imaging of Morrison's teams moving into their final positions. Other displays tracked digital traffic, power grid status, and the locations of Sullivan's scattered veterans. They're setting up vehicle checkpoints on all major roads, Chen reported, marking positions on their tactical display. Professional blocking, positions overlapping fields of fire. Once they activate, nobody's getting in or out of town without their permission. Sullivan nodded, studying the pattern. Classic isolation protocol. Cut off the target area, control all movement. He zoomed in on specific locations. But look at their positions. They're all focused on vehicle traffic. They're not accounting for the old ranch trails, the dry creek beds. The paths only locals know, Miguel added from his own station. He'd refused to leave despite Sullivan's urging, insisting on seeing this through. They may have maps, but they don't know the land like we do. Exactly. Sullivan pulled up a different overlay, showing routes that didn't appear on any official maps. While they're watching the roads, our people can move freely through the back country. But Morrison's too good not to have considered that. Which means he's got to have secondary teams, Chen finished. Hidden units ready to respond to anything unexpected. Position confirmed, Jenkins reported suddenly. Got a heat signature matching Morrison's. He's set up his command post at the old water tower. Perfect oversight of the whole operation. Sullivan studied the location thoughtfully. The water tower overlooked the town centre, providing clear lines of sight in all directions. Good choice. Defensible position, multiple escape routes, excellent communication sight lines. He paused, considering. Almost too perfect. Sir? Morrison's making it obvious where he is. He wants us to focus on him, plan our response around his location. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. Which means his real command post is somewhere else. The water tower is a decoy. Throughout the morning, more pieces of Morrison's operation fell into place. His teams conducted final equipment checks with professional precision. Communication systems were tested and verified. Medical support was staged at strategic locations. Everything spoke of meticulous planning and extensive experience. But Sullivan's veterans weren't idle. Under cover of normal daily activity, they moved their own pieces into position. Equipment cached months ago was quietly distributed. Escape. Routes were verified. Every member of Sullivan's network knew their role in what was coming. Latest intel from town, Miguel reported after receiving a call from Maria. Morrison's people are spreading word about a special town meeting tonight. Mandatory attendance, very official-looking notices. They're using the Harvest Festival Committee to make it seem legitimate. Sullivan nodded grimly. Perfect cover for getting everyone in one place, control the civilian population while they execute their operation. He studied the town hall blueprints. But gathering everyone together works both ways. Makes it easier for us to protect them. If we can, Chen said quietly. Morrison's got a lot of firepower out there. He does, Sullivan agreed. But he's planning to fight a conventional battle. We're not going to give him one. He turned to Jenkins. How are we looking on the technical side? The cyber specialist gestured to his arrays of equipment. Everything's in place. Power grid controls, communications infrastructure, emergency systems. We can control it all. The moment you give the word, we can plunge the whole town into chaos. Good. Morrison's people are trained to deal with confusion, but they expect it to come from the enemy. They won't be ready for their own systems to turn against them. Sullivan checked his watch. Time to start phase 1. Chen? The demolitions expert nodded. My teams are ready. Just say when. Sullivan studied the tactical displays one final time, watching Morrison's forces make their final preparations. Everything was proceeding exactly as they'd anticipated. Almost too perfectly. Something's wrong, he said suddenly, his instincts screaming warning. Morrison's being too obvious, too textbook. He knows better than this. What do you mean? Miguel asked. Look at his deployment pattern. Everything's exactly where we'd expect it to be, exactly where military doctrine says it should be. Sullivan manipulated the tactical displays. Morrison's fought enough irregular forces to know better. Unless he wants us to think we know his plan, Chen finished, understanding dawning. This whole setup could be elaborate misdirection. Sullivan nodded grimly. Which means we need to change our approach. Right now. He turned to his team. New plan. We assume everything we think we know about their operation is wrong. Everything we've seen is what Morrison wants us to see. But the town meeting tonight, Miguel started, is probably still part of their plan, but not how we think. Sullivan began marking new positions on their tactical displays. Morrison's trying to make us focus on protecting the civilians at Town Hall, which means his real target is somewhere else. A warning tone sounded from Jenkins' station. Boss, got something. Large heat signature just picked up at the old copper. Mine. Vehicles moving in from the south, lots of them. Sullivan moved to the display, studying the thermal imaging. His expression hardened as he recognized the pattern. That's their real assault force. Everything in town is just theater, meant to keep us distracted while their main body moves into position. The mine connects to old tunnels running under half the county, Miguel added. If they control those, they can move people and materials anywhere without being seen. Sullivan's mind worked through implications rapidly. The town meeting isn't about controlling civilians, it's about keeping law enforcement focused in one place while they establish their real infrastructure. Chen studied the new tactical situation. Your call, boss. Do we change the plan? Sullivan was quiet for a moment, decades of operational experience weighing options. Finally, he smiled. A cold, predatory expression that reminded everyone present why he'd been legendary in his field. No, he said quietly. We don't change the plan. We expand it. Morrison thinks he's being clever, playing us with misdirection. Time to show him what real deception looks like. The command center burst into activity as Sullivan laid out his new strategy. It was audacious, dangerous, and completely unexpected. Exactly what they needed against an opponent like Morrison. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sullivan's counter-operation began with subtle precision. Small things at first, minor equipment failures in Morrison's teams, slight communications disruptions, tiny delays that seemed random but were carefully orchestrated. Remember, Sullivan briefed his team leaders via secure channel. We're not trying to stop them. We're creating uncertainty, making them question their own operational security. Death by 1,000 cuts. In town, preparations for the evening meeting continued. Morrison's people maintained their cover perfectly, coordinating with local officials, setting up security under the guise of public safety. But Sullivan's veterans are watching, documenting each position, each hidden weapon, each concealed communications setup. They're good, Chen commented, observing through high-powered optics. Professional trigger discipline, proper security spacing, constant awareness. These aren't cartel thugs playing soldier. No, Sullivan agreed. They're legitimate operators, which makes them predictable. He turned to Jenkins. Status on the mine operation. The cyber specialist pulled up thermal imaging. Major activity continuing. They're bringing in serious equipment. Looks like mining machinery. But the heat, signatures are all wrong. Probably concealed weapons and tactical gear. Sullivan studied the feeds thoughtfully. The mine operation was extensive, far larger than anything they'd anticipated. Morrison wasn't just setting up a temporary base. He was establishing permanent infrastructure. Look at the scale, Sullivan noted, pointing to specific areas. These aren't just smuggling tunnels. They're building something bigger, some kind of underground operations center. Makes sense, Chen added. Hardened facility, hidden from satellite observation, multiple escape routes. Perfect base for controlling the entire region. Sullivan nodded grimly. Which means tonight isn't just about taking over the town. They're establishing a foothold for something much larger. He turned to his tactical displays. Time to implement Phase 2. Miguel, the rancher, stepped forward, now wearing tactical gear that looked surprisingly natural on him. My people are ready. Every ranch hand, every farmer who's ever served, they're all in position. Good. Remember, when it starts, your job is civilian protection only. Get people clear of the fighting. Use the evacuation routes we established. Sullivan's voice was firm. Leave Morrison's forces to us. As sunset approached, the town began gathering for the mandatory meeting. Morrison's teams maintained their professional demeanor, but Sullivan's surveillance caught the subtle signs of combat preparation. Weapons being checked, communications being verified, positions being confirmed. They're getting ready, Jenkins reported, monitoring their tactical channels. Lots of encrypted traffic. Whatever they're planning, it's starting soon. Sullivan checked his own equipment one final time. Everything was in place, charges set, routes prepared, teams positioned. Now came the waiting, always the hardest part of any operation. Remember, he told his team, Morrison expects us to react to his moves. Instead, we're going to make him react to shadows. Make him fight ghosts until he doesn't trust his own judgment. The sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. In the town hall, civilians gathered under the watchful eyes of Morrison's disguised operators. At the mine, heavy equipment continued to move under cover of legitimate mining activity. Everything was proceeding according to multiple plans: Morrison's official operation, his real operation at the mine, and Sullivan's counter-strategies. The pieces were set. Now it was just a matter of who would move first and how. "Sir," Jenkins called suddenly. "Got something weird. Thermal imaging showing movement at the old ranch properties. The ones the cartel bought months ago." Sullivan moved to the display, studying the heat signatures. His expression hardened as he recognized what he was seeing. "Those are tunnel-boring machines. They've been at this longer than we thought. The mine isn't the start of their underground network, it's the completion." The implications hit everyone in the command center. The cartel hadn't just recently decided to establish infrastructure. They'd been building it secretly for months, using legitimate property purchases as cover. "How did we miss this?" Chen asked, professional pride wounded. "Because we were looking for traditional cartel operations," Sullivan replied grimly. "This is something new. Morrison's not just running security for them, he's helping them establish permanent military-grade infrastructure throughout the region." Miguel studied the thermal imaging with growing concern. "If they've got tunnels under the ranches, they can move anything anywhere without being seen," Sullivan finished. "Drugs, weapons, people, complete invisible transit across the entire region." He smiled suddenly, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "But they made one mistake." "What's that?" "They got greedy. Instead of being satisfied with their hidden tunnels, they decided to take the town too. Make it all official and legitimate." Sullivan turned to his team. "That's why Morrison's here personally. This isn't just another cartel operation. This is them trying to establish their version of a forward operating base. And they need the town as cover." Chen understood immediately. "Which means they can't just kill everyone. They need the town to appear normal to the outside world." "Exactly. And that's their weakness." Sullivan began modifying their tactical plans. "They need a legitimate cover story for whatever happens tonight, which means they have to maintain certain appearances, follow certain rules." Jenkins looked up from his monitors. "Rules we don't have to follow." "Precisely." Sullivan's smile grew colder. "Morrison's designed his operation around controlling the civilian population while establishing his infrastructure. He's got contingencies for resistance, plans for dealing with law enforcement, strategies for maintaining legitimate appearance. But he's not prepared for what's about to happen, because we're not going to fight his forces directly. We're not going to engage in a conventional battle." Sullivan looked at each member of his team. "We're going to make his own operation, tear itself apart." The command center fell silent as Sullivan laid out his modified strategy. It was audacious, borderline insane, and completely against conventional tactical doctrine. It was also, everyone realized, possibly their only chance of success. "Questions?" Sullivan asked finally. Chen smiled grimly. "Just one. When do we start?" Sullivan checked his watch. The sun had set, and darkness was falling over the town. In the distance, lights were coming on at the town hall as people gathered for Morrison's staged meeting. "Now," Sullivan said quietly. "We start now." He keyed his radio, broadcasting on their secure channel. "Alunits, Operation Ghost Dance is go. I say again, Ghost Dance is go." Across the town and surrounding countryside, Sullivan's veterans began moving with deadly purpose. The night belonged to them now. And by dawn, Morrison would learn why some legends are best left undisturbed. The real operation was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. Operation Ghost Dance began exactly as Sullivan had planned, not with violence but with darkness. At precisely 8 p.m., the entire town's power grid went black. Emergency generators kicked in at the town hall, exactly as Morrison's team had prepared for, casting harsh light over the gathered civilians. "Status," Morrison barked into his radio, his professional demeanor masking growing concern. "Main grid. Failure, sir. Backup systems engaging as planned." But this was just Sullivan's opening move. Across town, carefully planted charges detonated simultaneously, not to destroy, but to distract. Water mains burst strategically, flooding key streets. Underground electrical conduits sparked dramatically. Traffic signals malfunctioned in choreographed chaos Multiple infrastructure failures, Morrison's operators reported. Pattern suggests coordinated attack. From his real command post, not the decoy at the water tower, Morrison studied the situation with growing unease. Deploy response teams, standard containment protocol. In Sullivan's command center, Jenkins monitored the cartel forces' reactions. They're moving exactly as predicted, response teams splitting up to handle multiple emergencies. Sullivan nodded grimly. Phase 2. Chen. The demolitions expert keyed his radio. All teams, execute. The real assault began with surgical precision. As Morrison's forces spread out to handle the manufactured emergencies, Sullivan's veterans struck from prepared positions. Years of experience and months of planning paid off as the cartel's professional operators found themselves engaged by an enemy they couldn't see. Contact front. The radio calls began coming rapidly. Taking fire from somewhere. Morrison's tactical display lit up with engagement reports, but no clear picture emerged. His forces were being hit from multiple directions, yet thermal imaging showed no enemy concentrations. They're ghosts, one operator reported, voice tight with tension. Can't get a fix on positions. Sullivan allowed himself a cold smile. Now, Miguel. Throughout the town, pickup trucks and farming vehicles suddenly roared to life. Local ranchers and farmers, many of them veterans themselves, began executing their own carefully planned roles, not fighting, but creating confusion. Vehicles blocked intersections. Farm equipment accidentally obstructed response routes. Every move appeared random but served to further fragment Morrison's forces. Sir, Morrison's tactical officer reported, we're losing cohesion. Units can't maintain formation with all these civilian vehicles. Morrison studied his displays intently. They're herding us, breaking us into smaller units. His eyes narrowed. Fall back to defensive positions. Regroup at primary rally points. But Sullivan had anticipated this. As Morrison's teams attempted to withdraw, they found their rally points compromised. Pre-positioned charges detonated, blocking access routes. Hidden shooters provided precise fire, not to kill, but to channel movement in specific directions. They're forcing us toward the mine, Morrison realized suddenly. Everything else is distraction. Their real target is our underground infrastructure. Sullivan watched Morrison's realization through intercepted communications. Phase 3. Jenkins? The cyber specialist initiated their next sequence. Throughout the tunnel system, carefully planted devices activated. Ventilation systems failed. Communication repeaters went dark. Emergency lighting flickered ominously. Sir, we're losing underground systems, Morrison's mine team reported. Something's affecting all electronic equipment. Morrison's mind raced. Through options, his forces were scattered, his underground facility compromised, and his carefully planned operation was unraveling. But he wasn't finished yet. Implement Protocol 0, he commanded. Full tactical response authorized. From concealed positions around town, Morrison's reserve teams emerged, heavily armed operators in full combat gear. No more pretense of legitimate security. These were professional killers, prepared for maximum violence. Here comes the hammer. Chen observed as their surveillance picked up the new deployments. Sullivan nodded calmly. Right on schedule. All teams, Phase 4. What happened next would be talked about in special operations circles for years. As Morrison's combat teams moved to engage, they found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. Veterans, who'd spent decades learning the art of irregular warfare, demonstrated their expertise. A 4-man cartel team approaching the north side of town was engaged simultaneously from 3 different positions. Before they could respond, the attackers vanished, only to strike again from new locations. They're inside our decision loop, Morrison realized grimly, anticipating every response. Sullivan's veterans pressed their advantage. Each cartel team found itself isolated, engaged, then left in confusion as their attackers melted away. The psychological impact was devastating. Professional operators, used to having tactical superiority, were being systematically outmaneuvered. At the mine entrance, Morrison's underground teams faced a different kind of battle. The tunnel systems they'd spent months preparing had become a maze of darkness and uncertainty. Equipment failures forced them to ground level, where Sullivan's forces were waiting. This isn't random, Morrison said finally, watching his operation collapse. This is personal. His eyes widened as understanding hit. Sullivan. Jack Sullivan. The name carried weight even among hardened operators. Stories of the legendary ghost who'd hunted terrorists across 3 continents, who'd written the book on irregular warfare only to disappear into retirement. "Confirm identity," Morrison ordered. "I want eyes on Sullivan." But Sullivan had no intention of being found. His presence was felt everywhere, in the precise planning, in the psychological warfare, in the way his forces seemed to predict and counter every move. "Sir," Morrison's tactical officer reported, "we're losing control of the situation. Team 3 is cut off. Team 4 reports they're being forced into prepared kill zones. Underground facility is completely dark." Morrison made his decision. Initiate scorched earth. Burn it all. But Sullivan had predicted this too. As Morrison's teams moved to implement their destruction protocols, they found their explosives had been compromised. Detonators failed. Timing. Devices malfunctioned. Even their backup systems proved unreliable. How? Morrison demanded. How did they get to everything? The answer came in the form of coordinated strikes against his remaining forces. Sullivan's veterans, now fully committed, demonstrated why experience trumps numbers. Each engagement was brief, precise, and decisive. In his command center, Sullivan watched the operation unfold with cold satisfaction. Final phase. Jenkins? The cyber specialist transmitted a specially prepared package to Morrison's command post. Security camera feeds showing his forces being systematically dismantled. Documentation of their entire operation, ready to be sent to law enforcement and rival cartels. Evidence that would destroy not just this operation, but the entire cartel's expansion plans. "Your move, Colonel," Sullivan transmitted on Morrison's command frequency. "You can lose quietly, or we can make this very, very public." Morrison studied the feeds in growing resignation. His forces were scattered, his infrastructure compromised, his mission in shambles. More importantly, he recognized the tactical genius behind his defeat. This hadn't just been a battle. It had been a lesson. "Stand down," he ordered finally. "All units, stand down." Sullivan allowed himself a small smile. Wise choice. He turned to his team. "Secure the prisoners. Document everything. By morning, I want no trace of their operation left." As his veterans moved to implement the cleanup, Sullivan reflected on the night's events. Morrison had brought superior numbers, equipment, and tactical training. But he'd forgotten the most important lesson. Off irregular warfare. Never underestimate an old ghost fighting on his home ground. The town slowly returned to normal. Power was restored. Water mains mysteriously repaired themselves. By dawn, the only signs of combat were a few scattered brass casings and some disturbed dirt at the mine entrance. Morrison, secured with his command staff, finally spoke directly to Sullivan through their communication link. "You could have killed us all. Why didn't you?" "Because dead men don't carry messages," Sullivan replied coldly. "You're going to report exactly what happened here. How a handful of veterans systematically dismantled your entire operation. How all your technology and training meant nothing against people fighting for their homes." "They'll send others," Morrison warned. "Maybe, but they'll send them somewhere else. This territory is now officially more trouble than it's worth." Sullivan's voice carried absolute certainty. "Spread the word, Colonel. Some places aren't meant to be taken. Some warriors never really retire." As morning painted the desert in shades of gold, Sullivan stood on his porch, watching cleanup teams erase the last traces of battle. The town would wake to find nothing unusual. Just another quiet day in ranch country. Miguel joined him, carrying fresh coffee. "Think they got the message?" Sullivan nodded slowly. "They got it. The cartels understand cost versus benefit. After tonight, moving into this territory will be seen as too expensive, too risky." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Sometimes the best way to win a war is to make your enemy realize they don't want to fight it." "What about Morrison and his men?" "They'll be released once we've documented everything. Their employers will probably kill them anyway, but that's not our concern." Sullivan's voice was matter of fact. "The important thing is that every cartel operator on the continent will soon know what happened here, how their best team was taken apart by ghosts." In the command center, Jenkins and Chen coordinated the final stages of cleanup. Evidence was catalogued, prisoners processed, and contingency plans verified. By noon, there would be no sign that one of the most sophisticated special operations battles in recent history had taken place. "Think they'll really stay away?" Chen asked as they worked. Sullivan considered the question. The cartel had invested millions in their infrastructure, committed significant resources to their expansion. But they'd also just watched their elite, Forces be systematically dismantled by an opponent they never saw coming. They'll try something eventually, he admitted. But not here, not directly. We've changed the equation, made them realize that some targets aren't worth the cost. He walked to his tactical displays, now showing the town returning to normal. Citizens would soon wake, go about their daily routines, never knowing how close they'd come to living under cartel control. And that, Sullivan reflected, was the greatest victory of all. The underground facilities would be sealed. The tunnels collapsed at strategic points. The cartel's infrastructure would become their tomb, a monument to the folly of underestimating old warriors. "Sir," Jenkins called from his station. "Got final confirmation. Morrison's report to his employers just went through. You'll want to see this." Sullivan read the report with growing satisfaction. Morrison had been thorough, professional, and absolutely clear about one thing. The territory was now under the protection of forces that couldn't be bought, couldn't be threatened, and couldn't be defeated by conventional means. "Get some rest," Sullivan told his team. "We've got cleanup to finish then." He smiled slightly. "Then maybe I can finally try this retirement thing again." But as he watched the sun rise over his ranch, Sullivan knew better. The cartels would adapt, find new targets, new territories to corrupt. And when they did, when they threatened other communities, other homes, well, some warriors never really retire. They just wait for the next battle that needs fighting. The operation was over. The ghosts would return to their quiet lives, blend back into the community, but they would remain vigilant, ready to defend their homes against any threat. And somewhere in the desert night, the legend of Jack Sullivan grew, a little larger, a warning to those who would threaten the peace of quiet communities. Some battles are won with bullets and bombs. Others are won by making your enemies realize that some prices are too high to pay, some warriors too dangerous to challenge. As Sullivan finally headed inside to get some rest, he touched the wedding ring he still wore. "Sorry about retirement, Sarah," he murmured. "But I think you'd understand. Some fights choose us. Some duties never end." The morning wind carried no reply, but Sullivan felt at peace. He'd protected his home, his friends, his way of life, and in doing so, he'd reminded the world that some old soldiers don't fade away. They just get better at choosing their battles. 3 days after Operation Ghost Dance, the town showed remarkably few signs of the battle that had nearly claimed it. Power flowed normally. Water mains functioned perfectly, and the only evidence of combat existed in the memories of those who had participated. Even the old mine entrance had been professionally sealed, looking for all the world like a routine closure of an exhausted operation. Sullivan sat at his kitchen table, studying after-action reports from his network of veterans. Chen had coordinated the cleanup with military precision, ensuring every shell casing, every piece of evidence was collected and properly disposed of. Jenkins had systematically erased their digital footprint, leaving no trace of their coordination or communications. "Final numbers," Chen reported, setting a fresh cup of coffee in front of Sullivan. 17 cartel operators in custody, all being handled through secure channels. 48 others evacuated with Morrison under surveillance. No civilian casualties, no lasting infrastructure damage. Sullivan nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. "And the underground facility?" "Completely sealed. We collapsed key sections, filled others with quick-setting concrete. Even if they wanted to recover anything, it would cost more than it's worth." Chen smiled slightly. "Plus, we left a few surprises in case anyone gets curious." The morning sun painted long shadows across Sullivan's tactical displays, still showing monitoring feeds from around the region. His network remained vigilant, watching for any sign of cartel retaliation. But so far, there'd been only silence. Miguel entered, carrying local newspapers. The headlines spoke of a minor power outage during a town meeting, nothing more. No mention of gunfire, no hint of the sophisticated battle that had taken place. "Maria's clinic is back to normal," Miguel reported, settling into a chair. "Even the state inspectors have disappeared without anyone questioning it. Your cleanup teams did. Good work. Professional ghosts," Sullivan replied with a slight smile. "We've had lots of practice making things disappear." He studied one of the papers. "Any word from your contacts in town?" "Some whispers, mostly from the veterans who were here before. They know something happened, even if they don't know exactly what." Miguel paused. "But the important thing is, people feel safer. The cartel's local representatives have all quietly moved on. Their properties are already up for sale. Jenkins looked up from his monitoring station. Speaking of property, got something interesting. Those ranches the cartel bought, they're being transferred to new owners, all local families, all with clean records. Looks like someone's trying to restore the original ownership pattern. Sullivan nodded, unsurprised. His old CIA contacts had been busy, using seized cartel assets to repair some of the damage their expansion had caused. It was part of the larger message. This territory was now under protection, and not just from Sullivan's network. What about Morrison? Chen asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Sullivan pulled up a secure communication on his laptop. Last report puts him in Colombia. He's gone back to more traditional security work, far from US borders. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Apparently, his report to the cartels was quite emphatic about the inadvisability of further operations in this region. The implications hung in the air. Morrison's reputation in the private military world was substantial. His assessment of the situation would carry significant weight with any organization considering similar operations. So it's over, Miguel asked hopefully. This phase is over, Sullivan corrected. The cartels will adapt, try new approaches, but they'll be more cautious now, more aware that some territories aren't worth the cost of taking. He stood, moving, to the window that overlooked his ranch. More importantly, other communities will learn from this. Other veterans will realize they don't have to watch helplessly as their homes are taken over. The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Through Sullivan's security cameras, they watched Maria's truck approach, followed by several, others carrying members of their extended network. Ah, Sullivan smiled. Right on time. The arrivals filtered into his command center, each carrying reports and updates from their various positions throughout the region. These were the invisible guardians who had helped make Operation Ghost Dance possible. Ranchers, farmers, local business owners, all with military or intelligence backgrounds, all committed to protecting their way of life. Latest surveillance. Report, a former Marine reconnaissance officer announced, spreading satellite imagery across Sullivan's tactical table. No unusual activity along any of the known transit routes. Cartel operations have shifted west, avoiding our entire sector. Others provided similar updates. Financial monitoring showed cartel investments being quietly withdrawn from the region. Intelligence sources reported new operational guidelines being issued to cartel commanders. Specific instructions to avoid certain territories now marked as high risk, low reward. They're adapting, Sullivan noted with satisfaction. Learning that some battles aren't worth fighting, he turned to his assembled team. But we need to adapt too. They'll be watching for our methods now, studying our tactics. We need to stay ahead of them. The meeting shifted into a planning session. Lessons learned from Operation Ghost Dance were analyzed and documented. New protocols were established, incorporating their experiences. The network that had come together to defend their homes was evolving into something more permanent, a shield against future threats. We're not looking for a war, Sullivan reminded them. Our goal is to make any potential aggressor realize that the cost of moving against us outweighs any possible benefit. Deterrence through capability and will. As the meeting continued, Maria pulled Sullivan aside. Jack, she said quietly, there's something you should know. Word of what happened here. It's spreading. Other communities are asking questions, looking for guidance. Sullivan had expected this. Success had a way of drawing attention, even when the details remained hidden. They'll need to find their own way, he said carefully. We can advise, share lessons learned, but each community has to build its own defense. And if they need more direct help? The question hung in the air. Sullivan studied the faces around him, veterans who had come out of retirement to defend their homes, professionals who had found new purpose in protecting their communities. He saw in their eyes the same fire that had driven him to act. Then, we'll help them, he said finally, carefully, quietly. But we'll help them understand that they're not helpless, that they don't have to watch their homes and way of life be taken from them. The meeting concluded with assignments and responsibilities distributed. Sullivan's network would maintain their vigilance, but with a new focus on sustainability and training. The lessons of Operation Ghost Dance would be preserved and passed on, ensuring that the knowledge and capabilities they developed wouldn't be lost. As the sun set, Sullivan found himself alone on his porch, watching the desert paint, itself in shades of gold and purple. The weight of command still rested on his shoulders, but it felt different now, more purposeful, more directed. Maria joined him, carrying 2 glasses of bourbon. To successful operations, she offered. Sullivan accepted the drink with a nod. To protecting what matters. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the day fade. Finally, Maria spoke. "You know this isn't really over, don't you? What we did here. It's just the beginning." "I know," Sullivan replied quietly. "The cartels will adapt, find new methods, try different approaches. And others will see what we've done, try to replicate it." He sipped his bourbon, thoughtfully. "Some will succeed, others will need help learning how to defend themselves. And you'll help them?" Sullivan touched the wedding ring he still wore, thinking of Sarah and the peaceful retirement they'd planned. "Some battles choose us, Maria. Some duties never really end." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I'm starting to think true peace isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about being strong enough to prevent it." The desert night settled around them, stars appearing in a sky untouched by city lights. In the distance, Sullivan's surveillance systems maintained their quiet vigil, operated by veterans who had found new purpose in protecting their homes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The cartels would adapt, evolve, seek new territories and methods. But they would remember what happened here, how their best operators were systematically dismantled by an invisible force, how their most sophisticated operation was turned against them. More importantly, others would remember too. Communities facing similar threats would learn that they weren't helpless. That experience and determination could overcome even the most sophisticated opponents. That some territories, protected by those who truly loved them, were simply too costly to take. Sullivan raised his glass to the desert night. "To the ghosts," he murmured. "May we always be ready when we're needed." The wind carried no reply, but Sullivan felt at peace. He had found his true retirement, not in avoiding conflict, but in standing ready to protect what mattered. Some warriors never really retire, he reflected. They just get better at choosing their battles. The desert dawn painted Jack Sullivan's ranch in familiar shades of gold and shadow, the sun rising over a landscape that had seen both war and peace. At 72, Sullivan still maintained his pre-dawn routine, moving through his property with the quiet efficiency that had kept him alive through countless operations. His command center, once a hub of tactical displays and surveillance feeds, had been partially dismantled. Some equipment remained, certain threats required constant vigilance. But the atmosphere of immediate crisis had faded. In its place was something more sustainable, more permanent. "Morning report," Jenkins called from his reduced but still impressive array of monitors. The cyber specialist had stayed on, converting part of Sullivan's barn into a regional monitoring station. "Got some interesting chatter from south of the border." Sullivan accepted a cup of coffee, studying the intelligence summaries. The cartels had been unusually quiet since Operation Ghost Dance, their usual aggressive expansion replaced by something more cautious, more considered. "They're adapting," Chen noted, joining them with his own tactical updates. "Look at these patrol patterns. They're staying well clear of our entire region, establishing buffer zones around areas with high veteran populations." Sullivan nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. This had been part of their larger strategy, not just defending one town, but changing the cartel's risk assessment calculations for entire territories. "What about Morrison?" Sullivan asked, though he already knew the answer. Their surveillance network had been tracking the former colonel's movements. Jenkins pulled up specific intelligence feeds. "Still in Colombia, running security for more traditional operations. His report about our capabilities has become required reading for cartel commanders. They're calling this region the Ghost Territory now." The nickname brought a slight smile to Sullivan's face. Reputation was a powerful deterrent, especially in the shadow worlds where cartels operated. The story of how their elite forces had been systematically dismantled by an invisible enemy had grown in the telling, becoming something approaching legend. But Sullivan knew better than to trust in legends alone. Throughout the region, his network of veterans maintained their vigilance. Training continued, capabilities were enhanced, and new defensive measures were developed. Peace through strength wasn't just a slogan, it was a daily commitment. Miguel arrived as the sun cleared the horizon, bringing news from town. The community was returning to its normal rhythms, but with subtle differences. Veterans who had participated in Operation Ghost Dance walked with new purpose. Civilians who had glimpsed the truth about that night's events carried themselves with quiet confidence. The Henderson Ranch sold yesterday, Miguel reported, settling into his usual chair. Local family bought it, third-generation farmers. Cartel front company didn't even try to compete for the bid. This was happening across the region. Properties that had been acquired for cartel operations were being sold back to legitimate owners, often at suspiciously reasonable prices. The message was clear. Some territories were simply too costly to hold. Maria sends her regards, Miguel continued. Says the clinic is running smooth again. Those state inspectors have been officially recalled, with commendations for their thorough work. He smiled slightly. Very neat way to explain their presence and departure. Sullivan nodded approvingly. The cover story his team had crafted was holding perfectly. Official records would show nothing more dramatic than routine inspections and minor infrastructure issues. The real story would exist only in the memories of those who had participated. Any word from our friends up north? Sullivan asked, referring to other communities that had reached out after hearing whispers of their success. 3 more requests for consultation this week, Chen reported, all from areas facing similar cartel expansion, veterans groups mostly, looking to protect their own territories. This had been an unexpected consequence of Operation Ghost Dance. While the details remained secret, word had spread through veteran networks about a successful resistance to cartel takeover. Communities facing similar threats had begun reaching out, seeking guidance and support. We'll help them, Sullivan decided, though he'd been considering this for weeks. Not directly. They need to build their own capabilities. But we can share lessons learned, help them understand what they're really facing. The morning sun climbed higher as Sullivan's team began coordinating their expanded mission. Maps were studied, intelligence was analyzed, and careful plans were developed. This wasn't just about defending one town anymore. It was about teaching others to defend themselves. Start with the basics, Sullivan instructed as they prepared briefing materials. They need to understand that this isn't about firepower or fancy tactics. It's about knowing your territory, using your experience, and making the enemy fight on your terms. The lessons of Operation Ghost Dance were distilled into practical guidance: how to identify cartel infiltration, how to coordinate community resources, how to make aggression more costly than cooperation. Each point was backed by hard-earned experience and proven results. As midday approached, Sullivan received an encrypted message from an old CIA contact. The intelligence community had noticed the cartel's changed behavior, their sudden reluctance to expand into certain territories. Questions were being asked, theories proposed. Let them wonder, Sullivan told his team. Sometimes the most effective deterrent is uncertainty. Let them try to figure out why some communities seem untouchable. But there was more to consider than just tactical success. Sullivan had seen how Operation Ghost Dance had transformed his community. Veterans who had felt sidelined by age or circumstance had rediscovered their purpose. Civilians had learned they weren't helpless against organized crime. A sense of shared responsibility had emerged, strengthening community bonds. Maria arrived in the afternoon, bringing lunch and local updates. The town's Harvest Festival Committee was planning their next event, deliberately choosing the same venue where Morrison's operation had been thwarted. People want to reclaim it, she explained. Make new memories to replace the hidden tension of that night. Even if they don't know exactly what happened, they know something changed. Sullivan understood. Communities, like individuals, needed to process trauma and victory in their own ways. The festival would be more than celebration. It would be affirmation that life continued, that threats could be overcome. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Sullivan's command center received an unexpected alert. A private aircraft had landed at a small airstrip 50 miles south, its passenger list raising immediate flags. Marcus Kane, Jenkins confirmed, pulling up surveillance footage. Traveling under a business alias, but it's definitely him. Sullivan's old second-in-command from Operation Shadowfall had been quiet since their confrontation at the festival. His appearance now could mean many things, none of them likely to be simple. Let him come, Sullivan decided after careful consideration. But arrange appropriate welcome procedures. Within an hour, Kane's rented car was approaching the ranch, monitored by multiple surveillance systems and quietly shadowed by Sullivan's veterans. The former operative drove openly, making no attempt to hide his approach. Sullivan met him on the inner porch. Two old warriors who had chosen very different paths. Kane had aged well, his silver hair and expensive suit creating an image of corporate success. But his eyes remained those of a predator, constantly assessing threats and advantages. Jack, Kane nodded in greeting. Nice place, very defensible. Marcus, Sullivan's voice was neutral. Long way from your usual hunting grounds. Kane smiled slightly. Just passing through, thought I'd stop by, share some interesting market intelligence. He gestured at the ranch house. Mind if we talk inside? Some things shouldn't be discussed in the open. Sullivan led him into the study, noting how Kane's experienced eyes catalogued defensive positions and tactical advantages. Chen and Jenkins maintained discreet positions nearby, ready for any contingency. The cartels are changing their expansion strategies, Kane began without preamble. Your little operation here has caused quite a stir in certain circles. They're calling this region no-entry territory now. Too expensive to take, too dangerous to hold. Sounds like a proper risk assessment, Sullivan replied mildly. Kane's smile widened slightly. Perhaps, but it's created some interesting opportunities. Other communities are starting to resist cartel expansion, some more successfully than others. He paused meaningfully. There's considerable interest in understanding why some territories seem better prepared than others. The implied question hung in the air. Sullivan studied his former comrade thoughtfully. Kane had always been clever, always looking for angles to exploit, but he was also professional enough to recognize when a situation had fundamentally changed. Some territories, Sullivan said carefully, benefit from experienced defenders, people who understand that protecting their homes isn't about firepower. It's about making aggression more costly than cooperation. Like here? Kane's eyes showed professional appreciation. I studied the after-action reports. Morrison's operation was textbook perfect, yet it fell apart against an enemy he couldn't even properly identify. Very ghost-like. Sullivan smiled coldly. Some old skills never fade. They just find new applications. Indeed. Kane reached into his jacket, moving slowly to avoid alarming Sullivan's security. He withdrew a thick envelope. Which is why I'm here. My employers have revised their strategic assessments. They're interested in exploring more cooperative approaches to territorial expansion. Sullivan didn't touch the envelope. Meaning, they're willing to establish buffer zones, recognize certain territories as off-limits for direct operations. In return, they want assurance that their traditional transit routes won't be completely blocked. Kane's voice was purely professional now. Think of it as a mutual non-aggression agreement. The proposal wasn't entirely unexpected. Cartels, for all their brutality, were ultimately businesses. They adapted to changing conditions, sought profitable compromises when direct confrontation proved too costly. And if we refuse? Kane shrugged elegantly. Then nothing changes immediately. But eventually, they'll find new approaches, develop new tactics. The cost of maintaining constant vigilance will grow. Good men will age, retire, die. And the pressure will never truly end. Sullivan considered the implications. The cartels were offering recognition of their success, attempting to transform a tactical victory into a strategic stalemate. It wasn't surrender. It was adaptation. Take the envelope, Kane urged. Consider the possibilities. Your Operation Ghost Dance showed them that some territories are too costly to take by force. Now they're offering to acknowledge that reality, formally. But Sullivan had spent too many years in shadow wars to trust in formal agreements. And what guarantee would we have that they'd honor such an arrangement? Kane's smile was knowing. The same guarantee you have now. Their understanding that crossing certain lines carries unacceptable costs. The only difference is, they're offering to recognize those lines officially rather than learning about them the hard way. Sullivan finally accepted the envelope, though he didn't open it. I'll consider it. But any agreement would require verification, enforcement mechanisms. Of course. Kane stood, adjusting his expensive suit. They understand that trust must be earned. They're prepared to demonstrate their sincerity through actions, not just words. As Kane prepared to leave, he paused at the door. One more thing, Jack. Shadowfall, those files I had, they've been destroyed. All copies, all backups. Consider it a gesture of professional courtesy. Sullivan nodded slowly. Some ghosts, it seemed, could be laid to rest after all. After Kane's departure, Sullivan gathered his core team to discuss the proposal. The envelope contained detailed maps showing proposed buffer zones, transit corridors, and neutral territories. More importantly, it included evidence that the cartels were already withdrawing from certain areas, demonstrating their willingness to comply. It's a serious offer, Chen noted, studying the documents. They're not just reacting to one defeat, they're restructuring their entire regional strategy. Jenkins agreed, analyzing digital traffic patterns. Their operations are already shifting, moving away from direct confrontation toward more traditional smuggling routes. They're adapting faster than we expected. Sullivan considered the implications carefully. The cartels were offering a form of détente, not peace exactly, but a mutual recognition of boundaries and capabilities. It was the kind of arrangement that had governed relations between opposing forces throughout history. We'll need to verify everything, he decided finally. Set up monitoring systems, establish clear tripwires, but if they're serious about cooperation. He paused, thinking of the communities that had reached out for help. This could provide a framework for protecting other territories too. The next few days were spent analyzing the proposal in detail. Sullivan's network expanded their surveillance, watching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. But the cartels appeared to be honoring their initial gestures, withdrawing forces from contested areas and avoiding provocative actions. A week later, Sullivan received another encrypted message, this time from William Hayes, his former CIA handler. The intelligence community had noticed the cartel's changed behavior and was cautiously optimistic about the implications. They're calling it the ghost doctrine, Hayes reported via secure channel. The idea that some territories are better left alone, that local resistance can make expansion too costly to attempt. Your Operation Ghost Dance is being studied as a model of asymmetric defense. Sullivan shared this information with his team, understanding its significance. What they'd accomplished wasn't just tactical victory, it was strategic transformation. They'd demonstrated that determined local defenders, properly organized and led, could effectively resist even sophisticated criminal enterprises. But we can't relax, he warned during a network coordination meeting. The cartels are adapting because we force them to. The moment they sense weakness, they'll test boundaries again. This led to new initiatives. Sullivan's veterans began developing training programs for other communities, teaching them the principles that had made Operation Ghost Dance successful. The focus was on sustainable defense, using local knowledge, coordinating resources, and making aggression consistently unprofitable. Maria's clinic became a hub for regional coordination, its legitimate medical operations providing cover for intelligence, gathering and network communication. Local veterans in other communities were identified and recruited, creating an expanding web of defensive capabilities. We're not building an army, Sullivan explained to his growing network. We're teaching communities to protect themselves. The goal isn't to fight cartels directly, it's to make them decide that fighting isn't worth the cost. This approach proved surprisingly effective. As word spread through veteran networks, more communities began organizing their own defensive preparations. The cartels, honoring their initial agreement, avoided direct confrontation with these emerging protective networks. 3 months after Operation Ghost Dance, Sullivan stood on his porch watching another desert sunrise. His command center had evolved into something more sophisticated, a regional coordination facility supporting multiple community defense networks. Morning report, Jenkins called from his expanded monitoring station. All zones showing normal activity. Cartel operations remaining within agreed boundaries. New defense network in Sector 4 coming online ahead of schedule. Sullivan nodded with satisfaction. The ghost doctrine was proving more effective than they'd dared hope. Communities were learning to protect themselves, cartels were adapting to new realities, and a form of sustainable security was emerging. Chen joined them, bringing tactical updates from their expanding network. 2 more veteran groups requesting training support, both in areas facing potential cartel expansion. They've heard about our success and want to replicate it. Send them the initial briefing package, Sullivan decided. Then arrange for direct consultation. They need to understand this isn't about winning firefights. It's about making their territories too costly to take. Miguel arrived with his usual morning intelligence update, but today he brought something extra. A local newspaper featuring a story about reduced crime rates across the region. The article noted a mysterious decline in cartel-related activities, suggesting that organized crime groups had somehow been convinced to avoid certain territories. They have no idea. Miguel smiled. reading the speculation about improved law enforcement and economic factors. Sometimes the best victories are the ones nobody knows about, Sullivan agreed, but his satisfaction went deeper. They hadn't just driven away one cartel operation, they'd created a sustainable model for community defense. The ghost doctrine was spreading, teaching others how to protect their homes and ways of life. As the morning progressed, Sullivan received reports from various parts of his network. Veterans in distant communities reported successful defense preparations. Cartels continued to honor buffer zone agreements. New territories were being added to the no-entry list as local defensive capabilities increased. Maria arrived with lunch and her own updates. The clinic's legitimate operations were thriving, its cover activities providing crucial intelligence about regional developments. More importantly, the community's confidence had grown. People walked taller, lived fuller lives, knowing they weren't helpless against organized crime. "You've started something important," she told Sullivan as they shared coffee. "Not just here, but everywhere. People want to protect their homes. You've shown them it's possible to resist, to maintain their independence." Sullivan considered her words carefully. When he'd first moved to the ranch, he'd hoped for quiet retirement. Instead, he'd found a different kind of purpose, teaching others the skills and principles that had kept him alive through decades of shadow warfare. As afternoon approached, Sullivan received another encrypted message from Hayes. The intelligence community had officially designated their region as a model for community-based territorial defense. Academic papers were being written about the ghost doctrine, though none fully understood the reality behind the theory. "Let them study it," Sullivan told his team. "Sometimes the legend is more useful than the truth. Let everyone wonder why some territories seem naturally resistant to criminal expansion." The day ended as it had begun, with Sullivan on his porch watching the desert sun paint the landscape in familiar colors. But now he saw more than just his own property. He saw a network of protected communities, each standing strong against forces that would have once seemed unstoppable. Chen joined him on the porch, offering a glass of bourbon. "You know, when I first signed on for Operation Ghost Dance, I thought it was just going to be one last mission. Never expected it to turn into all this." Sullivan smiled, accepting the drink. "Neither did I. Funny how some battles lead to unexpected victories." They stood in comfortable silence watching the desert night unfold. In the command center behind them, Jenkins continued monitoring their expanding network. Reports flowed in from protected territories, each confirmation of successful defense, adding to their growing legend. "Got something interesting," Jenkins called, from his station. "Cartel communications from South America. They're implementing new protocols for territorial expansion, calling it Ghost Protocol, basically requiring full assessment of local veteran populations before attempting any new operations." Sullivan nodded with satisfaction. The cartels were learning, adapting to new realities. Their aggression hadn't disappeared, but it was being channeled away from communities that could effectively resist it. "They're still moving product," Chen noted, studying the intelligence. "Still running their operations. We haven't stopped them completely." "No," Sullivan agreed, "but we've changed the rules of engagement, shown them that some fights aren't worth the cost." He sipped his bourbon, thoughtfully. Sometimes victory isn't about destroying your enemy, it's about making them choose different battles. As night settled over the desert, Sullivan's network continued its quiet vigilance. Veterans in distant communities maintained their watch, protecting territories that cartels now marked as high risk, low reward. The ghost doctrine was becoming more than strategy, it was becoming legend. Miguel arrived for the evening briefing, bringing news from town. The Harvest Festival Committee had finalized plans for their next event. It would be bigger than ever, a celebration of community resilience, though most attendees would never know the true significance. "People feel it," Miguel reported, settling into his usual chair. "They might not know exactly what's changed, but they feel safer, more confident, like they're part of something stronger than themselves." Sullivan understood completely. He felt it too, not just in his own community, but in reports from across their expanding network. People were rediscovering their power to resist, to protect what mattered to them. "Got another request for training support," Jenkins called out. "Veteran group in Texas this time. Their town's facing cartel pressure, but they've heard about communities successfully resisting takeover attempts. Send them the standard briefing package," Sullivan decided. "Then arrange for direct consultation. They need to understand this isn't about winning firefights, it's about making their territory too costly to take." The night deepened, Stars, emerging in a desert sky untouched by city lights. Sullivan's command center hummed with quiet activity, monitoring feeds from across their network. Each screen told part of a larger story. Communities standing strong, cartels adapting to new realities, territories becoming safer through strength and preparation. Maria arrived with evening coffee and medical updates. The clinic's legitimate. Operations provided perfect cover for network coordination, while actually improving healthcare access for the community. It was a pattern repeated across their protected territories. Defensive preparations leading to stronger, more resilient communities. "You've created something special," she told Sullivan, sharing coffee on the porch. "Not just a defense network, but a way for communities to rediscover their strength, to remember that they don't have to be victims." Sullivan considered her words carefully. When he'd first moved to the ranch, seeking quiet retirement, he never imagined becoming the architect of a new approach to community defense. But sometimes the most important battles choose their warriors. "We all created this," he corrected gently. "Every veteran who stood up to protect their home. Every community that refused to be intimidated. Every person who decided that some things are worth fighting for." As midnight approached, Sullivan received a final encrypted message from Hayes. The intelligence community was formally acknowledging the effectiveness of community-based territorial defense, though they still didn't fully understand the mechanism behind it. "Sometimes mysteries are more effective than explanations," Sullivan told his team. "Let them wonder why some territories resist takeover while others fall. The legend of the ghost doctrine will inspire more resistance than any tactical manual." The night wound down, his command center shifting to minimal staffing for overnight monitoring. Throughout their network, veterans maintained their vigil, protecting communities that now slept more securely because of their dedication. Sullivan made one final check of the tactical displays before heading inside. The screens showed their expanding zone of protection, territories where cartels now feared to operate openly. It wasn't perfect peace, that was probably impossible, but it was something more sustainable, security through strength and preparation. Touching the wedding ring he still wore, Sullivan smiled slightly. "Well, Sarah," he murmured, "it's not exactly the retirement we planned, but I think you'd approve. Some battles are worth fighting, especially when they protect what matters most." The desert night offered no reply, but Sullivan felt at peace. He had found his true purpose not in avoiding conflict, but in teaching others how to prevent it. The ghost doctrine would continue to spread, carried by veterans who understood that some warriors never really retire. They just find new ways to serve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new territories seeking protection, new adaptations by their adversaries. But Sullivan's network would be ready, their quiet vigilance ensuring that communities could stand strong against any threat. The legend of Operation Ghost Dance would grow, inspiring others to resist domination and protect their ways of life. And somewhere in the desert night, Jack Sullivan's legacy would live on, not just in tactical victories, but in the countless communities that learn to stand strong against the darkness. Some battles are won with bullets and bombs. Others are won by changing how your adversaries think, making them realize that some prices are too high to pay, some territories too costly to take. In the end, Sullivan reflected, that might be the most important victory of all.